Okay, this is going to be my book overview of The Road to Serfdom. We're going to breeze through my tabs and my highlights and maybe discuss a little bit on each of them, but we're not going to dive too deep. Overall, I found this a great read. I would highly recommend it. You can, of course, do the overview, but the way that he words things, it's just a very beautifully worded book. So my first highlight comes in the introduction, namely that it presupposes a much more complete agreement on the relative importance of the different ends than actually exists, and that, in consequence, in order to be able to plan, the planning authority must impose upon the people that detailed code of values which is lacking. Footnote on 18 that he mentioned this in Freedom in the Economic System, 1938. He followed with a much fuller exposition of why even democratic planning, if it were to be successfully carried out, eventually requires the authorities to use a variety of means, from propaganda to coercion, to implement the plan. I'm re-listening to Manufacturing Consent and studying the propaganda model put forward by Chomsky. So very interesting to see and look through that lens of everything that's happened the last couple of years. In the preface to the 1976 edition, I have highlighted that, feeling that the problems on which I had so undesignedly embarked were more challenging and important than those of the economic theory, and that much that I had said in my first sketch needed clarification and elaboration. When I wrote the book, I had by no means sufficiently freed myself from all the prejudices and superstitions dominating general opinion. I have since become very conscious, and the discussion of the consequences of socialist policies which the book attempts is of course not complete without an adequate account of what an appropriately run market order requires and can achieve. Further down he said, I feel no longer apologetic, but the first time I'm rather proud of it, and I was now often surprised, by which I did already see at the beginning of my efforts that later work has confirmed. I am now prepared unhesitatingly to recommend this early book to the general reader who wants a simple and non-technical introduction to what I believe is one of the most ominous questions which we have to solve. I like how he says, I didn't start out with an intent of like what the book was going to be, but it morphed into this and it became bigger than myself. So he just started working. He just started putting thoughts to paper. And from that sprang an eternal question, which he wanted to answer and then endeavored to answer in the book. At the time I wrote, socialism meant unambiguously the nationalization of the means of production and the central economic planning which made this possible and necessary. This is due to the fact that socialism has come to mean chiefly the extensive redistribution of incomes through taxation and the institution of welfare state. In the latter kind of socialism, the effects I discuss in this book are brought about more slowly, indirectly, and imperfectly. I believe that the ultimate outcome tends to be very much the same, although the process by which it is brought about is not quite the same as that described in this book. Socialism is bound to lead to totalitarianism, he later writes. Even though this danger exists, this is not what the book says. Perhaps pardonable when it was remembered that when I wrote, Russia was the wartime ally. That is just an important little fact as we go through the book when talking in regards to Russia. Knowing the time and the setting when this book came out is a great thing to know, so let's go check that out. There's a lot of highlights in here from the previous owner of the book, so that's interesting. So 1944 original text during the wartime. All right, let's go to the introduction. But while history runs its course, it is not history to us. So that's just very prescient, saying like we don't understand that we're in the middle of making history when it's happening to us. We just have to make the best choices that we know with the information that we have. The next paragraph I've highlighted, although history never quite repeats itself, we can in a measure learn from the past to avoid repetition of the same process. One need not be a prophet to be aware of impending danger. An accidental combination of experience and interest will often reveal events to one man under aspects which few yet to see. So your experience and the way that you've lived life and the things that you've seen, these all give you a foresight of things, if you will. You don't have to be a prophet to see things are going bad or things are going in a certain direction. You just have to have a little bit of experience and a little bit of interest in what's going on in order to anticipate what happens next. Thus, by moving from one country to another, one may sometimes twice watch similar phases of intellectual development. The senses have then become peculiarly acute. I think was an interesting insight, given that he's talking about living in multiple countries. I too have lived in another country, though briefly. It does give you a level of development that you would not otherwise have gotten, because you suddenly have to adapt to a new environment and provide some tremendous amount of growth within the individual. Few are ready to recognize that the rise of fascism and Nazism was not a reaction against the socialist trends of the preceding period, but a necessary outcome of those tendencies. This is a truth which most people were unwilling to see, even when the similarities of many of the other repellent features of the internal regimes in communist Russia and nationalist socialist Germany were widely recognized. As a result, many who think themselves infinitely superior to the aberrations of Nazism and sincerely hate all its manifestations work at the same time for ideals whose realizations would lead straight to the abhorred tyranny. All parallels between developments in different countries are, of course, deceptive, but I'm not basing my argument mainly on such parallels, nor am I arguing that these developments are inevitable. If they were, there would be no point in writing this. I think lays a great foundation in the introduction. On the next page, an enemy who uses propaganda as one of his main weapons not only is the most blatant but also in the most subtle forms, where the effect of this propaganda will not disappear with the defeat of the Axis powers. It is not enough if we are to show others that what we are fighting for is worth their support. It is not enough to guide us in the building of a new world safe against the dangers to which the old one has succumbed. Have not the parties of the left, as well as those of the right, been deceived by believing that the National Socialist Party was in the service of the capitalist and opposed to all forms of socialism? How many features of Hitler's system have not yet been recommended to us for imitation from the most unexpected quarters? The system is incompatible with the free society we hope to preserve. Because we do not understand the opponent, dangerous mistakes have been made before and since. 1. The abandoned road. The first sentence after a quote from Roosevelt I've highlighted, not the quote by Roosevelt, but when the course of civilization takes an unexpected turn, when, instead of the continuous progress which we have come to expect, we find ourselves threatened by evils associated by us with past ages of barbarism, we naturally blame anything but ourselves. I thought that was just very foretelling, because a lot of people go down the path of righteousness only to find themselves committing the very things that they abhorred to begin with. We are ready to accept almost any explanation of the present crisis of our civilization except one, that the present state of the world may be the result of genuine error on our own part, and that the pursuit of some of our most cherished ideals has apparently produced results utterly different from those which we have expected. While all our energies are directed to bring this war to a victorious conclusion, it is sometimes difficult to remember that even before the war, the values for which we are now fighting were threatened here and destroyed elsewhere. We still believe that until quite recently, we were governed by what we are vaguely called 19th century ideas or the principle of laissez-faire. Further on, I've highlighted, although we had been warned by some of the greatest political thinkers of the 19th century, Tocqueville and Lord Acton, that socialism means slavery, we have steadily moved in the direction of socialism. He provides a footnote. Wherever the barriers to the free exercise of human ingenuity were removed, man became rapidly able to satisfy ever-widening ranges of desire. And while the rising standard soon led to the discovery of very dark spots in society, spots which men were no longer willing to tolerate, there was probably no class that did not substantially benefit from the general advance provided by capitalism. We cannot do justice to this astonishing growth if we measure it by our present standard. The Western world had reached a degree of material comfort, security, and personal independence which 100 years before had seemed scarcely possible. And I think this is a great point that he makes, that advancement of all mankind due to capitalism is beyond compare. And he goes to lay out the best argument in the book against how an economic form of communism slash socialism would have to be brought about by jackboot powers, and it does not stimulate progressive growth. There's no freedom of thought. There is no ingenuity when it all has to be made by one party. So it's a very interesting book. What in the future will probably appear the most significant and far-reaching effect of this success is the new sense of power over their fate, the belief in the unbounded possibilities of improving their own lot, which we all can do. We all have a great starting point, which the success already achieved created among men. Wrapping up The Abandoned Road, Chapter 1, a couple more highlights. It might even be said that the very success of liberalism became the cause of its decline. Because of the success already achieved, man became increasingly unwilling to tolerate the evils still with him, which now appeared both unbearable and unnecessary. It became more and more widely accepted that further advance could be expected, not along the old lines within the general framework which had made past progress possible, but only by a complete remodeling of society. All we are here concerned to show is how completely, though gradually and by almost imperceptible steps, our attitude towards society has changed. The change amounts to a complete reversal of the trend we have sketched, an entire abandonment of the individualist tradition which has created Western civilization. Dr. Karl Mannheim says, mankind is tending more and more to regulate the whole of its social life, although it has never attempted to create a second nature. Footnote is Karl Mannheim, Man and Society in an Age of Reconstruction, Studies in Modern Social Structure, London, Kegan Paul, 1940, pages 175 to 176. Hungarian-born sociologist Karl Mannheim taught at Heidelberg and Frankfurt before fleeing to the LSE in 1933. Having been among the first academics dismissed under Hitler's Restoration of Civil Service Act in March 1933, he was invited as a visiting professor under the auspices of the Academic Freedom Committee set up by Beveridge and his LSE colleagues. For more on this, see Ralph Dahrendorf, LSE, A History of the London School of Economics and Political Science, 1895 to 1995. Sounds fascinating. Oxford University Press, 1995, pages 286 to 87. Mannheim is remembered today chiefly for his contributions to the sociology of knowledge. And just by saying that man has not tried to create a second nature just goes to say that, like, we have this nature, this base nature, this tendency within ourselves to be the caveman, and we've done everything to elevate ourselves, but the caveman inside of us is still just an animal. Western, in this sense, was liberalism and democracy, capitalism and individualism, free trade and any form of internationalism or love of peace. That is what Western civilization is about, the love of peace. And that's what I think is important to fight for. And capitalism gives us a great opportunity to fight for the love of peace. Chapter 2, The Great Utopia. A quote by Holderlin opens it up with, "What has always made the state a hell on earth has been precisely that man has tried to make it his heaven." I guess I'd heard versions of that before, but the more that you chase utopia, the more you realize it can't be achieved without certain extreme draconian measures being put in place. Socialism openly began as a reaction against the liberalism of the French Revolution. It is rarely remembered now that socialism in its beginnings was frankly authoritarian. The French writers who laid the foundations of modern socialism had no doubt that their ideas could be put into practice only by a strong dictatorial government. Society on hierarchical lines and by the imposition of a coercive spiritual power. Where freedom was concerned, the founders of socialism made no bones about their intentions. Freedom of thought they regarded as the root of evil, and the first of the modern planners, Saint-Simon, even predicted that those who did not obey his proposed planning boards would be treated as cattle. That's quoted and then cited. See Henri Saint-Simon, Letters from an Inhabitant of Geneva to his Contemporaries, 1760 to 1825, Selected Writings on Science, Industry, and Social Organization. Saint-Simon says, "Every man who fails to obey this commandment will be regarded and treated by others as an animal." The social reformer Claude-Henri de Ravoux, Comte de Saint-Simon, 1760 to 1825, was a founder of French socialism. In his account of the origins of scientism and of the abuse of reason, Hayek characterized Saint-Simon as a megalomaniac visionary. Only under the influence of the strong democratic currents preceding the revolution of 1848 did socialism begin to ally itself with the forces of freedom. Nobody saw more clearly than Tocqueville that democracy, as an essentially individualist institution, stood in an irreconcilable conflict with socialism. In quotes, democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality and restraint and servitude. I think these words are very insightful because if you look at any big multinational corporation or conglomerate, a lot of the way that the business is laid out is a very socialist structure, very animal farm-like, right? Because the managers, they're more equal than the other people, but like at the end of the day, it all goes to serve one central planning committee. Socialism began increasingly to make use of the promise of a new freedom. It was to bring economic freedom, without which the political freedom had already gained was not worth having. The subtle change in meaning to which the word freedom was subjected in order that this argument should sound plausible is important. The word had meant freedom from coercion, freedom from the arbitrary power of other men. What was left was the individual had no choice but obedience to the orders of a superior to whom he was attached. Restraints of the economic system. Freedom in the sense of course, merely another name for power or wealth, right? So wealth is freedom, power is freedom, the ability to decide and make decisions, to take control of your life. This is freedom. The demand for the new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for an equal distribution of wealth. Socialists, another word in common with the liberals, and they exploited it to the full. There can be no doubt that the promise of greater freedom has become one of the most effective weapons of socialist propaganda, and that the belief that socialism would bring freedom is genuine and sincere. Unquestionably, the promise of more freedom was responsible for luring more and more liberals along the socialist road, for blinding them to the conflict which exists between the basic principles of socialism and liberalism. Socialism was embraced by the greater part of the intelligentsia as the apparent heir of the liberal tradition. Therefore, it is not surprising that to them the idea of socialism's leading to the opposite of liberty should appear inconceivable. While progressives were still deluding themselves that communism and fascism represented opposite poles, more people began to ask themselves whether these new tyrannies were not the outcome of the same tendencies. A footnote about merely another name for power, freedom, and wealth, the characteristic confusion of freedom with power, which we shall meet again and again throughout this discussion, is too big a subject to be thoroughly examined here. As old as socialism itself, it is so closely allied with it that almost 70 years ago, a French scholar discussing its Saint-Simonian origins was led to say that this theory of liberty, esta est la suele tout de socialisme, Paul Genet Saint-Simon et le Saint-Simonisme, the most explicit defender of this confusion is significantly the leading philosopher of American left-wingism, John Dewey, according to whom liberty is the effective power to do specific things, so that the demand for liberty is the demand for power. See John Dewey, Liberty and Social Control, The Social Front. W.H. Chamberlain is quoted as saying, "Socialism is certain to prove, in the beginning at least, the road not to freedom, but to dictatorship and counter-dictatorships, to the civil war of the fiercest kind. Socialism achieved and maintained by democratic means seems definitely to belong to the world of utopias." What will be different this time? Will it be AI? Will that be the difference this time? Communists and fascists clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties. They competed for the support of the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. While to many who have watched the transition from socialism to fascism at close quarters, the connection between the two systems has become increasingly obvious. There can be no doubt that most socialists here still believe profoundly in the liberal ideal of freedom, and that they would recoil if they became convinced that the realization of their program would mean the destruction of freedom. So little is the problem yet seen that we can still hear such contradictions in terms as individualist socialism seriously discussed. Individualist socialism. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? That's why he's putting it out there. That democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something so utterly different that few of those who now wish it would be prepared to accept the consequences. Many will not believe until the connection has been laid bare in all its aspects. Chapter 3, Individualism and Collectivism. Right in the first paragraph, the very last sentence, in this sense, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership of the means of production, and the creation of the system of a planned economy, in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a central planning body. So I find this to be the most prescient and the most ultimate reason as to why socialism is never going to bear the fruits that we intellectually think it will, because there can be no efficiency without individual autonomy. The world can be a much better place if more individuals took up the personal responsibility for making the world better. This can't be done by a central planning authority. It's making the world better for all, when people who make the world better for themselves ultimately make the world better for everybody. There are many people who call themselves socialists, although they care only about the first, who fervently believe in those ultimate aims of socialism, but neither care nor understand how they can be achieved, and who are merely certain that they must be achieved, whatever the cost. The dispute about socialism becomes largely a dispute about means and not about ends, and it is more complicated by the fact that the same means, the economic planning, which is the prime instrument of socialist reform, can be used for many other purposes. It must also not be forgotten that socialism is not only by far the most important species of collectivism or planning, but it is socialism which has persuaded liberal-minded people to submit once more to the regimentation of economic life, which they had overthrown because, in the words of Adam Smith, it puts governments in a position where to support themselves they are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. Footnote was quoted in Dugald Stewart's biographical memoir of Adam Smith. A reprint of the 1793 memoir was released by Augustus M. Kelly in 1966. It is clear that the sort of planning which is necessary to realize any given distributive ideals, but as the idea of central economic planning owns its appeal largely to this very vagueness of its meaning, it is essential that we should agree on its precise sense before we discuss its consequences. Right? Defining terms is very important in order to discuss things and progress things forward. Planning owes its popularity largely to the fact that everybody desires that we should handle our common problems as rationally as possible, and that in doing so, we should use as much foresight as we can command. In this sense, everybody who is not the complete fatalist is a planner. An economist whose whole task is the study of how men actually do and how they might plan their affairs is the last person who could object to planning in this general sense. Everybody who isn't a nihilist, who isn't black-pilled, has some form of personal autonomy and planning. And the better organized they can be, the better their life will be. What our planners demand is a central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan, laying down how the resources of society should be consciously directed to serve particular ends in a definite way. So I would just call into question the bell curve and kind of generally, in a sense, think of like if society, either like the lowest 30% or the lowest 50% were given some form of like socialist programs, whether it be entitlement programs or what, a UBI maybe, that this is just going to only be allowed in capitalism, but it will only be limited. It won't be full socialism. But again, you can create pockets within a capitalist society. In fact, you can't have it without capitalism via the world as a whole, without free global trade. It just can't happen. It is a dispute about what is the best way of so doing. The question is whether for this purpose it is better that the holder of the coercive power should confine himself in general to creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope so that they can plan most successfully, or whether a rational utilization of our resources requires central direction and organization of all of our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. The liberal argument is in favor of making the best possible use of the forces of competition as a means of coordinating human efforts, right? So the classic definition of the liberal, right, the capitalist, the free loving person, is that it takes a group of people or yourself organizing, not a central authority. You don't have to wait to be told what to do. You know what's best, and you do, and you act. At the bottom of page 86, the only question here is whether in the particular instance the advantages gained are greater than the social costs which they impose. So what is the social cost of making the transition? And this question, I might argue, can never entirely be intuited beforehand or postulated beforehand. But it depends above all on the existence of an appropriate legal system that is designed both to preserve competition and to make it operate as beneficially as possible. It is by no means sufficient that the law should recognize the principle of private property and freedom of contract. He says, the systematic study of the forms of legal institutions which will make the competitive system work efficiently has been sadly neglected. And I wonder where that is at today, many decades later. And I just highlighted a footnote. Of late, it is true that some academic socialists, under the spur of criticism and animated by the same fear of the extinction of freedom in a centrally planned society, have devised a new kind of competitive socialism, in quotes, which they hope will avoid the difficulties and dangers of central planning and combine the abolition of private property with the full retention of individual freedom. Although some discussion of this new kind of socialism has taken place in learned journals, it is hardly likely to recommend itself to practical politicians. If it ever did it, it would not be difficult to show, as the author has attempted elsewhere, see Economica 1940, that these plans rest on a delusion and suffer from an inherent contradiction. It is impossible to assume control over all the productive resources without also deciding for whom and by whom they are to be used. Although under this so-called competitive socialism, the planning by the central authority would take somewhat more roundabout forms, its effects would not be fundamentally different, and the element of competition would be little more than a sham. So you can't do it, is what he's saying, because you still have to make all of the decisions in one location. One authority has to make all the decisions. Yet, though all the changes we are observing tend in the direction of a comprehensive central direction of economic activity, the universal struggle against competition promises to produce in the first instance something in many respects even worse, a state of affairs which can satisfy neither planners nor liberals, a sort of syndicalist or corporative organization of industry in which competition is more or less suppressed, but planning is left in the hands of the independent monopolies of the separate industries. And that is almost kind of what we have now in many ways, especially any of the noun-industrial complex, medical, technical, military, defense, right? Any of the industrial complexes that we have. Such independent planning by industrial monopolies would in fact produce effects opposite to those at which for the argument is planning to aim. The idea of complete centralization of the direction of economic activity still appalls most people, not only because of the stupendous difficulty of the task, but even more because of the horror inspired by the the idea of everything being directed from a single center. And wrapping up the chapter, planning and competition can be combined only by planning for competition, but not by planning against competition. It is of the utmost importance to the argument of this book for the reader to keep in mind that the planning against which all of our criticism is directed is solely the planning against competition, the planning which is to be substituted for competition. All right, we're going to dive into Chapter 4, The Inevitability of Planning. My first highlight says, most of them affirm that we can no longer choose but are compelled by circumstances beyond our control to substitute planning for competition. The myth is deliberately cultivated that we are embarking on the new course not of our free will, but because competition is spontaneously eliminated by technological changes which we neither can reverse nor wish to prevent. I thought that was prescient because of AI coming into being as we speak in 2024. We've had various forms of it in the past, but now it's become a very front-facing thing with stocks like Nvidia going through the roof and reaching valuations never before seen because of the demand for data centers and chipsets. The technological changes that we can't reverse or wish to prevent, that this argument is rarely developed in any length. It is one of the assertions taken over by one writer from another until, by mere iteration, it has become accepted as an established fact. It is nevertheless devoid of foundation. The tendency toward monopoly in planning is not the result of any objective facts beyond our control, but the product of opinions fostered and propagated for half a century until they have come to dominate all of our policy. The assertion that modern technological progress makes planning inevitable can also be interpreted in a different manner. It may mean that the complexity of our modern industrial civilization creates new problems with which we cannot hope to deal effectively except by central planning. It is the very complexity of the division of labor under modern conditions which makes competition. It is the very complexity of the division of labor under modern conditions which makes competition the only method by which such coordination can be adequately brought about. But once decentralization is necessary, the problem of coordination arises. This is precisely what the price system does under competition. It enables entrepreneurs, by watching the movement of comparatively few prices as an engineer watches the hands of a few dials, to adjust their activities to those of their fellows. The important point here is that the price system will fulfill this function only if competition prevails, right? Because you can, as an entrepreneur, decide for yourself what price to set based on the value that you provide. There is looking to your competitors and copying, or there is setting yourself aside and taking the blue ocean strategy and differentiating yourself by other factors that people care about. There's opportunity everywhere. You just have to be able to look at it, hold the vision, and attack it. It is no exaggeration to say that if we had had to rely on conscious central planning for the growth of our industrial system, it would never have reached the degree of differentiation, complexity, and flexibility that it has attained. The more obvious method of central direction is incredibly clumsy, primitive, and limited in scope. That the division of labor has reached the extent which makes modern civilization possible, we owe to the fact that it did not have to be consciously created, but that man tumbled on a method by which the division of labor could be extended far beyond the limits with which it could have been planned. This might be a good opportunity to sort of explain how the division of labor works. I'm an electrician, and one of the many things that I do quite repeatedly is change ceiling fans, and sometimes those are 20-foot ceilings. So this involves setting up a scaffold, getting up on there, taking the ceiling fan down, and then having another one fabbed and building it out as you install it. If you can have someone help you set up the scaffold while you're getting prepared, and then someone help set up the ceiling fan blades so that they can be attached, the quicker the labor gets divided, the quicker the task gets accomplished. That's what the division of labor means. And because of this division of labor internationally, we've been able to achieve much more rapid progression than we otherwise would have with a central planning authority. But the argument for freedom is precisely that we ought to leave room for the unforeseeable free growth. We have to leave room, right? This is what the beauty of economic freedom is that you can invent something, you can come up with a new service, a new idea, and you can bring it to the market yourself, and you don't have to have a central authority decide whether or not it's a good idea or that the masses need it. This is the freedom of economics. While it is true, of course, that inventions have given us a tremendous power, it is absurd to suggest that we must use this power to destroy our most precious inheritance, liberty. It does mean, however, that if we want to preserve it, we must guard it more jealously than ever, and that we must be prepared to make sacrifices for it. I don't know many people who have experienced the beauty of capitalism who wouldn't be willing to fight to maintain that for their offspring and for their future bloodlines. It's a beautiful thing. It's been a great life. I'm very young and I've lived the life that none of my ancestors ever have imagined. I've been to more countries than my ancestors, even immediate family, have ever been, right? Capitalism has provided so much opportunity, especially for somebody who has basic levels of work ethic. The hopes they place in planning, however, are the result not of a comprehensive view of society, but rather of a very limited view, and often the result of a great exaggeration of the importance of the ends they place foremost. This is not to underrate the great pragmatic value of this type of men in a free society like ours, which makes them the subject of just admiration, but it would make the very men who are most anxious to plan society the most dangerous if they were allowed to do so, and the most intolerant of the planning of others. From the saintly and single-minded idealist to the fanatic is often but a step. Just because somebody says they want good, how are they going to bring it about? I find the most interesting example of this recently this is after the Trump assassination attempt. This is 2024, August is when I'm recording this. And so this created a lot of social media hype and discussion. Many people wished that the bullet had hit. And it was very interesting that it was coming from mostly from international viewers of our system. And what I mean by this is, like, generally people who consider themselves socialist or wanting to see the socialist agenda are all about big love and loving everybody, unless it's somebody that they're told is a bad person. Then that person is exempt from the rules of being nice. They are bad, and so we can be mean to them. And so the saintly to, what did he say? The step is only a step. From the saintly and single-minded idealist to the fanatic is often a step. So just one little thing can change the way that someone who is saintly minded can act. And I found that to be the most telling example when the bullet missed, and these people who I would follow on Instagram who I thought were inspirational and kind and about, one mind, the hive mind, the love of humanity, they were the first to turncoat and show their true colors. So I just found that quote very, very omnipresent. Okay, chapter 5. Planning and Democracy. We open up with a quote from Adam Smith. The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with a most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted to no council and senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. Adam Smith, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, E.D. R.H. Campbell and A.S. Skinner, Volume 1, the Glasgow edition of the works and the correspondence of Adam Smith, Op. Citation, Book 4, Chapter 2, pages 456. And I starred in the second paragraph, but they all differ from liberalism and individualism in wanting to organize the whole of society and all its resources for this unitary end, and in refusing to recognize autonomous spheres in which the ends of the individual are supreme. The welfare of a people, like the happiness of a man, depends on a great many things that can be provided in an infinite variety of combinations. Which that just goes to say that socialism can't fulfill your happiness the way that an individual, and you know what you need to fulfill yourself, and you can achieve such through capitalism. Not if there's a central planning authority dictating everything and what to do. What's important to them may not be important to you, and vice versa. But where it all means to be used or property of society, and are to be used in the name of society according to a unitary plan, a social view about what ought to be done must guide all decisions. In such a world, we should soon find that our moral code is full of gaps. The rules of which our common moral code consists have progressively become fewer and more general in character. From the primitive man who was bound by an elaborate ritual in almost every one of his activities, and who was limited by innumerable taboos, and who could scarcely conceive of doing things in a way different from his fellows, morals have more and more tended to become merely limits circumscribing the sphere within which the individual could behave as he liked. The adoption of a common ethical code, comprehensive enough to determine a unitary economic plan, would mean a complete reversal of this tendency. The essential point for us is that no such complete ethical code exists. The attempt to direct all economic activity according to a single plan would raise innumerable questions to which the answer could be provided only by a moral rule, but to which existing morals have no answer, and where there exists no agreed view on what ought to be done. Not only do we not possess such an all-inclusive scale of values, it would be impossible for any mind to comprehend the infinite variety of different needs of different people which compete for the available resources, and to attach a definite weight to each. Only you can define your worth, is what I wrote in the column next to that nobody can define, given the complex and infinite amount of outcomes what is right for every single person on an individual basis. And so this is one of the many qualms with a socialism or communism type central authoritarian planning committee. This is the fundamental fact on which the whole philosophy of individualism is based. It does not assume, as is often asserted, that man is egoistic or selfish or ought to be. It merely starts from the indisputable fact that the limits of our powers of imagination make it impossible to include in our scale of values more than a sector of the needs of the whole society, and that since, strictly speaking, scales of value can exist only in individual minds. Common action is thus limited to the fields where people agree on common ends. Very frequently, these common ends will not be ultimate ends to the individuals, but means which different persons can use for different purposes. What individuals combine in a joint effort to realize ends they have in common, the organizations, yet still with its separate and limited sphere in which alone its ends are supreme. Although each individual might wish the state to act in some way, there will be almost as many views about what the government should do as there are different people. Everyone's got an opinion. We can rely on voluntary agreement to guide the action of the state only so long as it is confined to spheres where agreement exists. But not only when the state undertakes direct control in fields where there is no such agreement, it is bound to suppress individual freedom. There is then scarcely an individual end which is not dependent for its achievement on the action of the state, and the social scale of values which guides the state's action must embrace practically all individual ends. And at what point does it stop? Where do you draw the line? And that's the question that we cannot answer. That planning creates a situation in which it is necessary for us to agree on a much larger number of topics than we have been used to, and that in a planned system we cannot confine collective action to the tasks on which we can agree, but are forced to produce agreement on everything in order that any action can be taken at all, is one of the features which contributes more than most to determining the character of a planned system. The conviction grows that if efficient planning is to be done, the direction must be taken out of politics and placed in the hands of experts, permanent officials, or independent autonomous bodies. Getting deeper into what it means to have a central planning authority, not only can we not even broach the topic based on the ethical considerations, let's go ahead and set that aside and dive in just to see how things play out. And to make it quite clear that a socialist government must not allow itself to be too much fettered by democratic procedure. Whether in a period of transition to socialism, a labor government can risk the overthrow of its measures as a result of the next general election, and left it significantly unanswered. I footnoted that with number 4 down here. Basically it says, so footnote number 4, H.J. Lasky, Labor and the Constitution, New Statesman and Nation, NS number 81, September 10th, 1932, page 277. In a book, Democracy in Crisis, University of Chapel Hill Press, 1933, page 87, in which Professor Lasky later elaborated these ideas, his determination that parliamentary democracy must not be allowed to form an obstacle to the realization of socialism is even more plainly expressed. Not only would a socialist government take vast powers and legislate under them by ordinance and decree, and suspend the classic formulae of normal opposition, but the continuance of parliamentary government would depend on its, i.e. the labor government's, possession of guarantee from the Conservative Party that its work of transformation would not be disrupted by repeal in the event of defeat in the polls. So basically, if it's going to work, it has to be like removed from discussion, so it can't be undone. And so that is kind of like this all-encompassing power that it demands, which few people are not willing to hand over, and rightly so. As Professor Lasky invokes the authority of the Donoughmore Committee, it may be worth recalling that Professor Lasky was a member of the committee and presumably one of the authors of its report. The Donoughmore Committee on Ministers' Power was set up to investigate the implications of the expansion of delegated legislation, that is, legislation that is enacted by ministers in order to carry out primary legislation that is passed by Parliament. Hayek makes further reference to its findings in the next. The next highlight reads that it is the essence of the economic problem that the making of an economic plan involves the choice between conflicting or competing ends, different needs of different people. It is inevitable that they should impose their scale of preferences on the community for which they plan. So no matter what, somebody is going to lose, because ultimately the central planning authority has to pick the outcome and dictate that. And so whatever biases the central planning authority has, whatever mission the central planning authority has, whatever outcome, it's going to make sure that that is followed to a T and nothing gets in the way. And so if you might be disabled and you have no use for the central planning authority, then what happens? These are all questions that the Nazis partly answered for us, but we must also take into consideration in the future. AI could potentially change a lot of that. with a expiring currency of sorts and a form of universal basic income, we shall see how much monopoly money-esque the game becomes. But at the end of the day, we are evolving and capitalism is leading the charge. The delegation of particular technical tasks to separate bodies, while a regular feature, is not yet the only first step in the process whereby a democracy which embarks on planning progressively relinquishes its powers. Yet agreement that planning is necessary, together with the inability of democratic assemblies to produce a plan, will evoke stronger and stronger demands that the government or some single individual should be given powers to act on their own responsibility. The belief is becoming more and more widespread that if things are to get done, the responsible authorities must be freed from the fetters of democratic procedure. The cry for an economic dictator is a characteristic stage in the movement towards central planning. In Germany, before Hitler came to power, the movement had already progressed much further. It is important to remember that, for some time before 1933, Germany had reached a stage in which it had, in fact, had to be governed dictatorially. Hitler did not have to destroy democracy, he merely took advantage of the decay of democracy. And that's what we've got to be careful about in any despot or potential political leader that we put into office. When the body charged with the planning has to choose between ends of whose conflict Parliament is not even aware, and when the most that can be done is to present to it a plan which has to be accepted or rejected as a whole, there may and probably will be criticism. It is the price of democracy that the possibilities of conscious control are restricted to the fields where true agreement exists, and that in some fields things must be left to chance. But in a society which for its functioning depends on central planning, this control cannot be made dependent on majorities being able to agree. It will often be necessary that the will of a small minority be imposed upon the people, because this minority will be the largest group able to agree among themselves on the question at issue. So that's the other thing, is the people that come to represent this central planning authority will ultimately have the dictatorial power, and oftentimes we know that absolute power corrupts absolutely, in the sense of it doesn't matter who does get in power. Essentially their biases and their humanity comes out, their flaws come out. That's why capitalism is one of the best forms, is because only the honest and the best can win. Right? The free hand of the market does exist. Yes, we have black market. Yes, we have underground trade. But at the end of the day, certain things are established and built on trust, which can't really be accomplished with a central planning authority. It cannot be said of democracy, as Lord Acton truly said of liberty, that it is not a means to a higher political end. It is itself the highest political end. It is not for the sake of a good public administration that it is required, but for the security and pursuit of the highest objects of civil society and private life. He said that in The History of Freedom and Antiquity, op. citation page 22. Democracy is essentially a means, a utilitarian device for safeguarding internal peace and individual freedom. This is why democracy is so important, because it is very utilitarian, and utilitarianism can get you very far in a democratic society. Utilitarianism, though, can't get you far in a communist or centrally planned economic society, because the utilitarianism has to be determined by the single planning authority. You don't have the autonomy to determine for yourself that you need 4 chickens instead of 5 chickens, or 6 chickens instead of 3 chickens, right? The central planning authority dictates that for you, and everything has an equality of outcome. And if it doesn't actually happen because of some sickness or some bias or some disability, because the system cannot accommodate that, then you're SOL. And it is at least conceivable that under the government of a very homogeneous and doctrinaire majority, democratic government might be as oppressive as the worst dictatorship. Our point, however, is not that dictatorship must inevitably extirpate freedom, which means destroy, but rather that planning leads to dictatorship, because the dictatorship is the most effective instrument of coercion and the enforcement of the ideals. So if central planning on a large scale is to be possible, the most effective way to achieve this is through some form of dictatorship. A true dictatorship of the proletariat, even if democratic in form, if it undertook centrally to direct the economic system, would probably destroy personal freedom as completely as any autocracy has ever done. And wrapping up this chapter, my highlight of, it is not the source but the limitation of power which prevents it from being arbitrary. Democratic control may prevent power from becoming arbitrary, but it does not do so by its mere existence. I think this chapter is just really great in kind of calling out the differences in capitalism and communism or socialism, depending on what part you're trying to argue from. He goes on to say that while we do need to recognize that capitalism has its downfalls, it is the best safeguard and the best checks and balances, because more and more capitalism means freedom of information, and freedom of anything means freedom of advancement. And without the freedom of advancement and utilitarianism and the people to act in ways that benefit themselves and their neighbors and their families, then nothing would get done, because the only way to determine what is necessary for everybody would have to be done by this central authority. And that's why I think in the age of AI, we have to be careful about who are we giving authoritarian planning over to. And there are certainly organizations out there that would like to have it, such as the World Economic Forum and more. All right, chapter 6, planning and the rule of law. My first highlight isn't until the second page. In the end, somebody's views will have to decide whose interests are more important, and these views must become part of the law of the land, a new distinction of rank which the coercive apparatus of government imposes upon the people. So a new kind of rank a new order will form. In our age, with its passion for conscious control of everything, it may appear paradoxical to claim as a virtue that under one system we shall know less about the particular effect of the measures the state takes than would be true under most other systems, and that a method of social control should be deemed superior because of our ignorance of its precise results. Yet this consideration is in fact the rationale of the great liberal principle of the rule of law, and the apparent paradox dissolves rapidly when we follow the argument a little further. The argument is twofold. The first is economic and can here only briefly be stated. The state should confine itself to establishing rules applying to general types of situations, and should allow the individual's freedom in everything which depends on the circumstances of time and place, because only the individuals concerned in each instance can fully know these circumstances and adapt their actions to them. If, on the other hand, the state were to direct the individual's actions so as to achieve particular ends, its actions would have to be decided on the basis of the full circumstances of the moment and would therefore be unpredictable. Hence the familiar fact that the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual, right? So the more that a central authority has to plan and dictate things, the harder it is for you, because you have to relinquish power. So there is no independent action. There is no working for yourself. There is no going out and doing things on a spur of the moment or trying to accomplish something because you're good at it. The state decides for you what your job is and what you are to do for others in service to the entirety. The second moral or political argument is even more directly relevant to the point under discussion. If the state is precisely to foresee the incidence of its actions, it means that it can leave those affected no choice. The state ceases to be a piece of utilitarian machinery intended to help individuals in the fullest development of their individual personality and becomes a moral institution. In this sense, the Nazi or any other collectivist state is moral, while the liberal state is not. So, and again, liberal does not mean what it means in today's day and age. Liberal means Western, free, intellectual, intelligentsia, seeking freedom, autonomy of self, and individualism. Those most immediately interested in a particular issue are not necessarily the best judges of the interests of society as a whole. In such instances, it is readily recognized that no general principle such as fairness can provide an answer. When we have to choose between higher wages for nurses or doctors and more extensive services for the sick, more milk for children, and better wages for agricultural workers, or between employment for the unemployed or better wages for those already employed, nothing short of a complete system of values in which every want of every person or group has a definite place is necessary to provide an answer, right? There are so many snowflakes in the world, and that's impossible to meet the desires and the needs of everyone. However, capitalism provides a system to which each individual snowflake can pursue their own ends to feel fulfillment, whatever that may mean for them, whether it's choosing a passion in choosing a pursuit of music, pursuing craftsmanship of a certain trade, pursuing higher service in the medical field, serving others, or serving others in your intelligence by becoming a financial advisor or a lawyer. All of these things would be denied to you based on the rule of law imposed by a central planning authority. It cannot be denied that the rule of law produces economic inequality. All that can be claimed for it is that the inequality is not designed to affect particular people in a particular way. The important thing is that the rule enables us to predict other people's behavior correctly, and this requires that it should apply to all cases, even if in a particular instance we feel it to be unjust. So even if something is unjust with a central planning authority, you don't get to be the dictate of that. Neither does a panel or jury of your peers. They don't get to bemoan or becry on your behalf whether you are innocent or guilty, or whether the actions being perpetrated are just or unjust. It is the central planning authority who decides whether its actions are just or unjust. The important question is whether the individual can foresee the action of the state and make use of this knowledge as a datum in forming his own plans. The rule of law was consciously evolved only during the liberal age and is one of its greatest achievements, not only as a safeguard, but as the legal embodiment of freedom. As Immanuel Kant put it, and Voltaire expressed it before him in very much the same terms, man is free if he needs obey no person, but solely the laws. As vague an ideal as it is, however, existed at least since Roman times, and during the last few centuries it has never been so seriously threatened as it is today. To say that in a planned society the rule of law cannot hold is therefore not to say that the actions of the government will not be legal or that such a society will necessarily be lawless. It means only that the use of the government's coercive powers will no longer be limited and determined by pre-established rules. The law can, and to make a central direction of economic activity possible, must legalize what to all intents and purposes remains arbitrary action. So arbitrary action meaning meaningless action, and it's going to have to legalize whatever it has to do in order to achieve the outcome, right? We're looking for equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity in a centrally planned system. And so this arbitrary action, even if it is fair or unfair, just or unjust to a certain group of people, still must be carried out. If the law says that such a board or authority may do what it pleases, anything that board or authority does is legal, but its actions are certainly not subject to the rule of law. By giving the government unlimited powers, the most arbitrary rule can be made legal, and in this way, a democracy may set up the most complete despotism imaginable. And so that's the thing that we have to educate on, is because we can absolutely come to a system such as this through capitalism, where we delegate everything to a single person and choose this person to be the economic king of everything. And that person is going to have to choose the outcome of everything. And that's just impossible given so many variables and so many unique people. I, on the one hand, believe that people should be able to free and choose to do what they want to do and brings them purpose and fulfillment. As long as they're able to put food and nourish their bodies and their families, they are free to pursue their passions. Something that is not possible with a central planning authority, to say the least. I've highlighted in a footnote that men form civil societies and submit themselves to laws in order to better preserve their liberty and their property. Yes, as much as the police force is needed and firefighters are needed, we submit ourselves to the laws, the common laws of other people, the generally accepted principles of being able to survive and get by in this world, being nice to each other, what makes sense, what is fair and just. And so these are the things that we submit to, yet we can still have our freedom as long as it doesn't impose upon someone else's freedom to live their life the way they want. And that is the ultimate test that we need to apply to everything. As soon as any sort of aggression happens, then we fall into the rule of law. You're not just free to go cause others harm. You are free to cause yourself harm in many ways, but not others. And others should not be free to cause you harm. And if they do, they should be held to the rule of law, for this is just. If, however, the law is to enable authorities to direct economic life, it must give them powers to make and enforce decisions in circumstances which cannot be foreseen and on principles which cannot be stated in generic form. Consequence is that, as planning extends, the delegation of legislative powers to diverse boards and authorities becomes increasingly common. So if this person who is put in power of the Central Planning Economic Committee, if he's any sort of intelligent, he will start delegating all the actions that need to be completed. And so that means there's going to be a lot of other boards of this, a board of that, some other legislative power, whether it be on the city, the town, or neighborhood council, right? The HOA will become very important in a communist dictatorial society. Constantly, the broadest powers are conferred on new authorities, which, without being bound by fixed rules, have almost unlimited discretion in regulating this or that activity of the people. The rule of law thus implies limits to the scope of legislation. It restricts to the kind of general rules known as formal law and excludes legislation either directly aimed at particular people or at enabling anybody to use the coercive power of the state for the purpose of such discrimination. It means that not everything is regulated by law, but on the contrary, that the coercive power of the state can be used only in cases defined in advance by the law and in such a way that it can be foreseen how it will be used. The individual rights which Mr. Wells hopes to preserve would inevitably obstruct the planning which he desires, in reference to H.G. Wells writing an ardent defense about some socialism. His declaration proclaims that every man shall have the right to buy and sell without any discriminatory restrictions anything which may be lawfully bought and sold, in such quantities and with such reservations as are compatible with the common welfare. There is really no restriction which this clause effectively prevents, and no right of the individual that is safeguarded by it. And that wraps up chapter 6, which brings us to chapter 7, economic control and totalitarianism. 7. Economic control and totalitarianism. The control of the production of wealth is the control of human life itself, said Hilary Belloc. Most planners who have seriously considered the practical aspects have little doubt that a directed economy must be run on more or less dictatorial lines. One of the most prominent economic planners, Stuart Chase, assures us, for instance, that in a planned society, political democracy can remain if it confines itself to all but economic matters. Such assurances are usually accompanied by the suggestion that by giving up freedom in what are or ought to be the less important aspects of our lives, we shall obtain greater freedom in the pursuit of higher values. On this ground, people who abhor the idea of a political dictatorship often clamor for a dictator in the economic field. If our economic activities really concerned only the inferior or even more sordid sides of life, of course we ought to endeavor by all means to find a way to relieve ourselves from the excessive care of material ends, and leaving them to be cared for by some piece of utilitarian machinery, set our minds free for the higher things in life. A subtitle that I made on the quote, political democracy can remain if it confines itself to all but economic matters. The quotation by Chase, with no mention of its original source, may be found in Walter Lippmann, The Collectivist Movement in Practice, Atlantic Monthly, volume 158, December 1936, page 729. Accountant, freelance writer, and prolific author Stuart Chase, 1888 to 1985, was a popular writer in the interwar years. And I think that gives a great reference point, right? The interwar years, talking about World War II. The ultimate ends of the activities of reasonable beings are never economic. Strictly speaking, there is no economic motive, but only economic factors conditioning our striving for other ends. Economic motive means merely the desire for general opportunity, the desire for power to achieve unspecified ends, which is footnoted with 3, The Economic Causes of War by C.F. Lionel Robbins. Economic causation. Okay, in his appendix, Robbins discusses the meaning of the term economic causation and concludes, the causes of war are to be regarded as economic if the objective is purely instrumental to securing for some person or persons a greater command of resources in general. They are to be regarded as non-economic if the objective is not instrumental to anything further, if it is definitely an end in itself rather than means for a number of ends. If we strive for money, it is because it offers us the widest choice in enjoying the fruits of our efforts. Because in modern society, it is through the limitation of our money incomes that we are made to feel the restrictions which our relative poverty still imposes upon us. Many have come to hate money as the symbol of these restrictions, but this is to mistake for the cause the medium through which a force makes itself felt. It would be much truer to say that money is one of the greatest instruments of freedom ever invented by man. Socialists characteristically propose the pecuniary motive were largely displaced by non-economic incentives. If all rewards, instead of being offered in money or privileges, power over other men or better housing or better food, opportunities for travel or education, this would merely mean that the recipient would no longer be allowed to choose, and that whoever fixed the reward determined not only its size, but also the particular form in which it should be enjoyed, right? So you don't get to decide that you want a TV or a PlayStation or an Xbox. You get to be told what you get with a central economic authority. Everyone gets the same car. Economic changes, in other words, usually affect only the fringe, the margin of our needs. There are many things which are more important than anything which economic gains or losses are likely to affect. This makes many people believe that anything which, like economic planning, affects only our economic interests cannot seriously interfere with the more basic values of life. This, however, is an erroneous conclusion. Economic values are less important to us than many things precisely because in economic matters we are free to decide what to us is more and what less important. Or, since when we declare our specific purpose we shall also have it to get approved, we should really be controlled in everything. The question raised by economic planning is not merely whether we shall be able to satisfy what we regard as more or less important needs in the way that we prefer. It is whether it shall be we who decide what is more and what is less important for us, or whether this is to be decided by the planners. It would control the allocation of the limited means for all of our ends, and whoever controls all economic activity controls the mean for all of our ends and must therefore decide which are to be satisfied and which are not. Central planning means that the economic problem is to be solved by the community instead of by the individual. But this involves that it must also be the community, or rather its representatives, who must decide the relative importance of different needs. The so-called economic freedom which the planners promise us means precisely that we are to be relieved of the necessity of solving our own economic problems, and that the bitter choices which this often involves are to be made for us, since under modern conditions we are for almost everything dependent on means which our fellow men provide. Economic planning would involve direction of almost the whole of our life. Our freedom of choice in a competitive society rests on the fact that if one person refused to satisfy our wishes, we can turn to another. But if we face monopolists, we are at his mercy, and an authority directing the whole economic system would be the most powerful monopolist conceivable. While we need probably not be afraid that such an authority would exploit this power in the manner in which a private monopolist would do so, while its purpose would presumably not be the extortion of maximum financial gain, it would have complete power to decide what we are to be given and on what terms. It would not only decide what commodities and services were to be available and in what quantities, it would be able to direct their distribution between districts and groups, and could, if it wished, discriminate between persons to any degree it liked. Not only in our capacity as consumers, however, and not even mainly in that capacity, would the will of the authority shape and guide our daily lives. It would do so even more in our position as producers. These two aspects of our lives cannot be separated. And for most of us, most of the time we spend at our work is a large part of our whole lives. And as our job usually also determines the place where and the people among whom we live, some freedom in choosing our work is probably even more important for our happiness than freedom to spend our income during the hours of leisure. No doubt it is true that even in the best of worlds, this freedom will be very limited. Few people ever have an abundance of choice of occupation. But what matters is that we have some choice, that we are not absolutely tied to a particular job which has been chosen for us, or which we may have chosen in the past. And if one position becomes quite intolerable, or if we set our hearts on another, there is almost always a way for the able, some sacrifice at the price of which he may achieve his goal. So, with a central planning authority, you are told where you're needed most. So when the factories need workers, everyone gets sent to the factories. When the farms need farm hands, people get sent to the farm. And you don't get to complain because you relinquish that choice. And so if you hate your job, you can study hard and get out of it, or you can keep going and have some freedom in at least what kind of labor you perform for a monetary fee. So this is a very good point to make, that at the end of the day, with a central authority for planning, you will not be able to have any freedom of choice in what you do for work. But the point is that the kind of state action which really would increase opportunity is almost precisely the opposite of the planning which is now generally advocated and practiced. By prescribing the remuneration, it would no less effectively bar groups of people from entering many trades than by specifically including them. A rather plain girl who badly wants to become a saleswoman, a weakly boy who has set his heart on a job where his weakness handicaps him, as well as in general the apparently less able or less suitable, are not necessarily excluded in a competitive society. If they value the position sufficiently, they will frequently be able to get a start by a financial sacrifice, and will later make good through qualities that are at first not so obvious. But when the authority fixes the remunerations for a whole category, and the selection among the candidates is made by an objective test, the strength of the desire for their job will count for very little. The person whose qualifications are not of the standard type, or whose temperament is not of the ordinary kind, will no longer be able to come to special arrangements with an employer whose dispositions will fit in with his special needs. The person who prefers irregular hours, or even a happy-go-lucky existence with a small and perhaps uncertain income to a regular routine, will no longer have this choice. Conditions will be, without exception, what in some measure they inevitably are in a large organization, or rather worse, because there will be no possibility of escape. So if you are 5'5" and you want to become a basketball player, if you work hard enough, you can do it. With communism, there's probably not going to be any sports or anything like that. So that's besides the point. But what he is saying is that if you are someone who likes to have an office job, but you get put out in the fields for farming or agriculture or in the trades, then you are not going to have the opportunity to leave because you don't like it. You are very perfectly capable, according to the Central Economic Authority, of performing the job that you've been assigned to, regardless of your intellect. To make this immense task manageable, it will have to reduce the diversity of human capacities and inclinations to a few categories of readily interchangeable units and deliberately to disregard minor personal differences. That in a competitive society, most things can be had at a price, though it is often a cruelly high price that we have to pay, is a fact the importance of which can hardly be overrated. The alternative is not, however, complete freedom of choice, but orders and prohibitions which must be obeyed, and, in the last resort, the favor of the mighty. If the people who protest against having the higher values of life brought into the cash nexus really mean that we should not be allowed to sacrifice our lesser needs in order to preserve the higher values, and that the choice should be made for us, this demand must be regarded as rather peculiar and scarcely testifies to great respect for the dignity of the individual. What they resent is, in truth, that there is an economic problem. In their wishful belief that there really is no longer an economic problem, people have been confirmed by irresponsible talk about potential plenty. But although this snare has served socialist propaganda under various names as long as socialism has existed, it is still as palpably untrue as it was when it was first used over 100 years ago. In all this time, not one of the many people who have used it has produced a workable plan of how production could be increased so as to abolish, even in Western Europe, what we regard as poverty, not to speak of the world as a whole even. This potential plenty is footnoted in number 5 here. This is a long footnote. To justify these strong words, the following conclusions may be quoted by Colin Clark. The Conditions of Economic Progress from London Macmillan, 1940, pages 3 to 4. The oft-repeated phrases about poverty in the midst of plenty and the problems of production having already been solved if only we understood the problem of distribution turn out to be the most untruthful of all modern cliches. The underutilization of productive capacity is a question of considerable importance only in the USA, though in certain years it has also been of some importance in Great Britain, Germany, and France, but for most of the world it is entirely subsidiary to the more important fact that, with productive resources fully employed, they can produce so little. The age of plenty will still be a long while in coming. If preventable unemployment were eliminated throughout the trade cycle, this would mean a distinct improvement in the standard of living of the population of the USA. But from the standpoint of the world as a whole, it would only make a small contribution towards the much greater problem of raising the real income of the bulk of the world population to anything like a civilized standard. British statistician and economist Colin Clark, 1905 to 1989, taught and held government positions in England, the United States, and Australia. He was a pioneer in the estimation of national incomes. While the popular movement still profits by this false belief of potential plenty, the claim that a planned economy would produce a substantially larger output than the competitive system is being progressively abandoned by most students of the problem. Hope that a planned society will equal the efficiency of a competitive system, I highlighted, because it's just, there's only nothing but hope, right? Living on a prayer. To secure a more just and equitable distribution of wealth, this is indeed the only argument for planning which can be seriously pressed, which is the equality of outcome for everyone to be more or less equal in all things, including wealth. In consequence, the substitution of central planning for competition would require central direction of a much greater part of our lives than was ever attempted before. It could not stop at what we regard as our economic activities, because we are now, for almost every part of our lives, dependent on somebody else's economic activities. That's footnoted at 6, which I blocked. I think it's very important. It is no accident that in the totalitarian countries, be it Russia or Germany or Italy, the question of how to organize the people's leisure has become a problem of planning. The Germans have even invented for this problem the horrible and self-contradictory name of Freizeitgestaltung, literally the shaping of the use made of people's free time, as if it were still free time when it has been spent in the way ordained by an authority. So if we have this system come into power, this economic central authority planning committee, your free time is no longer going to be dedicated to what you want your free time to be dedicated to. No more video games, no more watching football on Sundays, no more books at night before you go to bed. Your free time is dictated because everything falls into an economic category of some sorts. The passion for the collective satisfaction of our needs with which our socialists have so well prepared for the way of totalitarianism, which consists essentially in depriving us of choice. The economic freedom, which is the prerequisite of any other freedom, cannot be the freedom from economic care, which the socialists promise us and which can be obtained only by relieving the individual at the same time of the necessity and of the power of choice. You no longer get to decide what's necessary for you and your family. Your choice has been removed, and this is what happens in a totalitarian system, which is the end result of any central planning authority form of economic power. Chapter 8. Whom, my first highlight says, but depend on their capacity and their luck. It is nonetheless true because in competition, chance and good luck are often as important as skill and foresight in determining the fate of different people. The fact that the opportunities open to the poor in a competitive society are much more restricted than those open to the rich does not make it less true that in such a society the poor are much more free than a person commanding much greater material comfort in a different type of society. It is not only possible for the former, but the competitive system is the only one where it depends solely on him and not on the favors of the mighty, and where nobody can prevent a man from attempting to achieve this result. And it is only because we have forgotten what unfreedom means that we often overlook the patent fact that in every real sense, a badly paid, unskilled worker in this country has more freedom to shape his life than many a small entrepreneur in Germany or a much better paid engineer or manager in Russia. Although sometimes the price he may have to pay for following his inclinations may be high, and to many appear too high, there are no absolute impediments, no dangers to bodily security and freedom that confine him by brute force to the task and the environment to which a superior has assigned him. So no matter what, even in today's America, if you don't want to work for somebody, you don't have to work for them. So everybody kind of has to be nice if they want to have proper laborers. You have to be a good person. It is only because the control of the means of production is divided among many people acting independently that nobody has complete power over us. Right? We are all autonomous. We all have the freedom to make our neighborhood, our community, and the world around us a better place. And by doing that through community service or whatever service you provide to society for a fee, these and all things are doable. What he's getting at is that if you wanted to have a system, say, similar to a church community that relies on the goodwill and favor of others as opposed to a fiat currency, then this system is only truly possible in a capitalist state where you can all agree to come together for the common good, for a common purpose. And so I would look further and deeper into finding what are the values as opposed to the name on the cover. What are the values? The everlasting, the evergreen, the ever true, the ever strong, actual values. It's only because of that division and the independent thought that we have to be good and be nice and come together and not begrudge one another is the only reason that America entered into so many golden ages in the years past. It's because we all had the manifest destiny. We all met it with gusto and charged full forward into serving each other, being good, doing good for others, doing good for our families and our community. At the same time encouraging, if all the means of production were vested in a single hand, whether it be nominally that of society as a whole or that of a dictator, whoever exercises this control has complete power over us. As soon as you point the finger, as soon as you let someone else make the decisions, you give away your power and your control over yourself, your executive function to be a good person. At the same time encouraging to find as prominent an old communist as Max Eastman rediscovering this truth, in quotes, "It seems obvious to me now, though I have been slow, I must say, in coming to the conclusion that the institution of private property is one of the main things that has given man that limited amount of free and equalness that Marx hoped to render infinite by abolishing this institution." Strangely enough, Marx was the first to see this. He is the one who informed us, looking backwards, that the evolution of private capitalism with its free market had been a precondition for the evolution of all of our democratic freedom. It never occurred to him, looking forward, that if this was so, these other freedoms might disappear with the abolition of the free market. Yeah, the free market is the closest thing, right? The free market can have its biases, but at the end of the day, time heals all wounds. His position in life must be assigned to him by somebody else. While people will submit to suffering which may hit anyone, they will not so easily submit to suffering which is the result of the decision of the authority. It may be bad to be just a cog in an impersonal machine, but it is infinitely worse if we can no longer leave it, if we are tied to our place and to the superiors who have been chosen for us. Insofar as government does anything at all, its action will always have some effect on who gets what, when, and how. These phrases presumably mean not only that economic forces are now allowed to work for ends which are not part of the policy of the government, but also that the economic power can be used independently of government direction and for ends of which the government may not approve. But the alternative is not merely that there should be only one power, but this single power, the ruling group, should have control over all human ends, and particularly that it should have complete power over the position of each individual in society. There is no socialist movement which aimed at complete equality that has ever gained substantial support. Not equality in the absolute sense, but greater equality is the only goal which it is seriously aimed at. This doesn't achieve the desired outcome or the book version of socialism/communism, right? You can't have just greater equality. You have to have true equality, because if there's greater equality, there's still greater than and less than, and that means somebody is still less than, and this is not true socialism. Though these two ideals sound very similar, they are as different as possible as far as our problem is concerned. While absolute equality would clearly determine the planner's task, the desire for greater equality is merely negative, no more than an expression of dislike of the present state of affairs. While agreement on complete equality would answer all of the problems of merit the planner must answer, the formula of the approach to greater equality answers practically none. It does not free us from the necessity of deciding in every particular instance between the merits of particular individuals or groups. Most people find it difficult to admit that we do not possess moral standards which would enable us to settle these questions, if not perfectly, at least to greater general satisfaction than is done by the competitive. Have we not all some idea of what is a just price or a fair wage? Can we not rely on the strong sense of fairness of people? And even if we do not now agree fully on what is just or fair in a particular sense, would popular ideas not soon consolidate into more definite standards if people were given an opportunity to see their ideals realized? These are great questions, right? Because, isn't it really up to the two end users on a consumer to consumer transaction to, in a free and open market, have the freedom to determine the price for which they are willing to pay for the other person's good or service? For instance, with inflation, it muddles the water and it confuses many people. But at the end of the day, the price that you determine to make the trade at, that is the price that you, between two free and willing parties, have decided is fair and just. And although no doubt there would be some attempt at standardization by creating categories, the necessity of discrimination between individuals would remain the same, whether it were exercised by fixing their individual incomes or by allocating them to particular categories. It is because successful planning requires the creation of a common view on the essential values that the restriction of our freedom with regard to material things touches so directly on our spiritual freedom. And I think that is very important, especially for those of us who have sought enlightenment throughout their lives. The spiritual freedom that we have as beings of light is very, very important. And while capitalism may not be the perfect system, it is still the best system to freely choose to congruently form with others to make this outcome happen, right? So ultimately, you agree on the set of values as a society. And because you've agreed on this set of values as a society, this means that it does matter proportionally, and you have the freedom to move around, right? So that's why cities and states are so different, is because the populations that make them up are so vast and changing different. The conflict between the fascist or national socialist and the older socialist parties must indeed very largely be regarded as the kind of conflict which is bound to arise between rival socialist factions. This is what we see a lot of nowadays when we're talking about the left is eating the left, the left is eating the left, right? There's this silent majority who's just logic is logic, facts are facts. And then there's the left, these idealists, and that they can't quite agree on who is more equal than the others. And they knew that the strongest group, which rallied enough supporters in favor of a new hierarchical order of society, and which frankly promised privileges to the classes to which it appealed, was likely to obtain the support of all those who were disappointed because they had been promised equality, but found that they had merely furthered the interest of a particular class. Which brings us to chapter 9, security and freedom. He opens up chapter 9 with a quote by Lenin and Leon Trotsky. I don't highlight any of those, but the spurious economic freedom and with more justice, economic security is often representative as an indispensable condition of real liberty. Independence of mind or strength of character is rarely found among those who cannot be confident that they will make their own way by their own effort. You have to be confident that you know the path forward that's correct for your life. Some people who don't have that confidence don't like the system that we're in. There are difficult questions about the precise standard which should thus be assured. There is particularly the important question whether those who thus rely on the community should indefinitely enjoy all the same liberties as the rest, with a footnote of 3. There are also serious problems of international relations which arise if mere citizenship of a country confers the right to a standard of living higher than elsewhere, and which ought not to be dismissed too lightly. Further down, I've highlighted, there is finally the supremely important problem of combating general fluctuations of economic activity and the recurrent waves of large-scale unemployment which accompany them. A full paragraph that I have highlighted here is that the planning for security which has such insidious effect on liberty is that for security of a different kind. It is planning designed to protect individuals or groups against diminutions of their income, which although in no way deserved, yet in a competitive society occur daily, against losses, imposing severe hardships, having no moral justification, yet inseparable from the competitive system. This demand for security is thus another form of the demand for a just remuneration. A remuneration commensurate with the subjective merits, not with the objective result of a man's efforts. This kind of security or justice seems irreconcilable with freedom to choose one's employment. Yeah, you just play that back. No wonder that in consequence the value attached to the privilege of security constantly increases, the demand for it becomes more and more urgent, until in the end no price, not even that of liberty, appears too high. But if the changes in the distribution of men between different employments, which are constantly necessary in any society, can no longer be brought about by pecuniary rewards and penalties which have no necessary connection with subjective merit, they must be brought about by direct orders. When a person's income is guaranteed, he can neither be allowed to stay in his job merely because he likes it, nor choose what other work he would like to do. So, if you don't like it, you don't get a choice because your income doesn't matter, right? But you have to do the job that you're assigned, no matter what your emotions say, no matter whether you have a good feeling for this job, no matter what it is about the job. To know whether, as the result of a change, a man ought to leave a trade in an environment which he has come to like and exchange it for another, it is necessary that the changed relative value of these occupations to society should find expression in the remunerations they offer. The problem is, of course, even more important because in the world as it is, men are, in fact, not likely to give their best for long periods unless their own interests are directly involved. So there's only something that can be considered a lifetime commitment or a long-term goal, and if it is within and congruent with your personal interests, you will work hard and tirelessly to achieve it. But if you have been given a task by a central authority, you may not have the same motive because it may not align with your vision for your life. The application of the engineering technique to a whole nation, and this is what planning means, raises problems of discipline which are hard to solve. In the absence of such a free reservoir, discipline cannot be maintained without corporal punishment, as with slave labor. So what happens in a communist regime, a socialist regime, when there is a lack of employment for certain sectors, for certain jobs? You get assigned to this job and you don't want to do the job. How is it enforced that you do the job? If your income doesn't rely on it, if your outcome doesn't rely on it, if you have no motivation to do the job, what motivation is left? How can you be motivated? Which is why I think that there could be a sort of expiration-based income available in a form of a UBI, and more or less of it could buy potential products. The whole system would have to be thought out right, because using your short-term dollars to buy, say, an air conditioning unit versus your expiring currency to buy some food for the next month, I think this is an interesting question that has to be figured out. The powers the manager of any plant will have to be given will still be considerable, but no more than in the case of the worker can the manager's position and income in a planned system be made to depend merely on the success or failure of the work under his direction. As neither the risk nor the gain is his, it cannot be his personal judgment, but whether he does what he ought to have done according to some established rule, which must decide. A mistake he ought to have avoided is not his own affair. It is a crime against the community and must be treated as such. So any hesitation is punishable by what? Death? maybe. While so long as he keeps to the safe path of objectively ascertainable duty, he may be surer of his income than the capitalist entrepreneur. The danger which threatens him in case of real failure is worse than bankruptcy. He may be economically secure so long as he satisfies his superiors, but this security is bought at the price of the safety of freedom and life. That proposals of this sort have in the past proved so little acceptable is due to the fact that those who are willing to surrender their freedom for security have always demanded that if they give up their full freedom, it should also be taken from those not prepared to do so. For this claim, it is difficult to find a justification. If we want to form a picture of what society would be like if, according to the ideal which has seduced so many socialists, it was organized as a single great factory, we have to look to ancient Sparta or to contemporary Germany, which, after moving for 2 or 3 generations in this direction, has so nearly reached it. In a society accustomed to freedom, it is unlikely that many people will be ready deliberately to purchase security at this price. But the policies which are now followed everywhere, which hand out the privilege of security, now to this group and now to that, are nevertheless rapidly creating conditions in which the striving for security tends to become stronger than the love of freedom. And if you look around at the type of world that those who would use coercive control try to illusory create around you, a world of the worst, a world of child predators, a world of kidnappers, a world of violent crime, of everything's burning and it's not safe out there. These are the ones who want you to cry for help, to take everything personally, to be a victim, because in a victim society there can be a savior, and the savior will always be the almighty central authority, the state. The state and the administrative state loves a victim they can provide for, a victim they can place on life support, and a victim that they can garnish a vote. Where distinction and rank are achieved almost exclusively by becoming a salaried servant of the state, there is no longer anything left except to be the most in service to the almighty government. Once things have gone so far, liberty indeed becomes almost a mockery, since it can be purchased only by the sacrifice of most of the good things of this earth. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Footnote of number 10 by Benjamin Franklin in the Pennsylvania Assembly reply to the governor November 11th, 1755. And I've highlighted another footnote that we missed because it didn't hit until later on, but I highlighted that those who know the normal life of the poor, its haunting sense of impending disaster, its fitful search for beauty which perpetually eludes, will realize well enough that without economic security, liberty is not worth having. So this is a harsh way to say that the people who truly, truly love and truly respect capitalism for what it is came from poor backgrounds. Only in America do you ever hear the story of somebody who pulls them up from their bootstraps. This story is also achievable in places like Europe and other first world countries, of course, but there are so many countries and socialist and communist states and regimes that this story doesn't happen because it can't happen. You're no longer allowed to become some sort of hero in your own story if the regime that you're in isn't capitalism. Capitalism provides you the freedom to become the hero of your story, because only under capitalism can you make enough money to become a benefactor for good. Being a benefactor for good and a generational force for good is only done through individual people doing good things for other individual people. You can't rely on a single authority to dictate what is right is wrong, right? What is right and wrong is decided by the people and the community, and the community can only become number one in a capitalist society. Chapter 10, Why the Worst Get on Top, an opening quote by Lord Acton. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. My first highlight reads that no doubt an American or English fascist system would greatly differ from the Italian or German models. No doubt, if the transition were effected without violence, we might expect to get a better type of leader. And if I had to live under a fascist system, I have no doubt that I would rather live under one run by Englishmen or Americans than under one run by anybody else. Just as the democratic statesman who sets out to plan economic life will soon be confronted with the alternative of either assuming dictatorial powers or abandoning his plans, so the totalitarian dictator would soon have to choose between disregard of ordinary morals and failures. It is for this reason that the unscrupulous and uninhibited are likely to be more successful in a society tending towards totalitarianism. My next highlight on the next page is, we must here return for a moment to the position which precedes the suppression of democratic institutions and the creation of a totalitarianism regime. In this stage, it is general demand for quick and determined government action that is the dominating element in the situation. Dissatisfaction with the slow and cumbersome course of democratic procedure which makes action for action's sake the goal. It is then the man or the party who seems strong and resolute resolute enough to get things done, who exercises the greatest appeal. Strong, in this sense, means not merely a numerical majority. It is the ineffectiveness of parliamentary majorities with which people are dissatisfied. What they will seek is somebody with such solid support as to inspire confidence that he can carry out whatever he wants. It is here that the new type of party, organized on military lines, comes in. In the Central European countries, the socialist parties had familiarized the masses with political organizations of a semi-military character designed to absorb as much as possible of the private life of the members. All that was wanted to give one group overwhelming power was to carry the same principle somewhat further, to seek strength not in the assured votes of huge numbers at occasional elections, but in the absolute and unresolved support of a smaller but more thoroughly organized body. The chance of imposing a totalitarian regime on a whole people depends on the leaders first collecting round him a group which is prepared voluntarily to submit to that totalitarian discipline which they are to impose by force upon the rest. The old socialist parties were inhibited by their democratic ideals. They did not possess the ruthlessness required for the performance of their chosen task. It is characteristic that both in Germany and Italy, the success of fascism was preceded by the refusal of the socialist parties to take over the responsibilities of government. They were unwillingly wholeheartedly to employ methods to which they had pointed the way. They still hoped for the miracle of a majority's agreeing on a particular plan for the organization of the whole of society. Others had already learned the lesson that in a planned society, the question can no longer be on what to do. A majority of the people agree, but what the largest single group is whose members agree sufficiently to make united direction of all affairs possible. There are three main reasons why such a numerous and strong group with fairly homogeneous views is not likely to be formed by the best, but rather by the worst elements of any society. By our standards, the principles on which such a group would be selective will be almost entirely negative. In the first instance, it is possibly and probably true that in general, the higher education and intelligence of individuals become, the more their views and tastes are differentiated and the less likely they are to agree on a particular hierarchy of values. It is a corollary of this that if we wish to find a high degree of uniformity and similarity of outlook, we have to descend the regions of lower moral and intellectual standards where the more primitive and common instincts and tastes prevail. This does not mean that the majority of people have low moral standards. It merely means that the largest group of people whose values are very similar are the people with low standards. It is, as it were, the lowest common denominator which unites the largest number of people. It will be those who form the mass in the derogatory sense of the term, right? The baskets of deplorables, the least original and independent, who will be able to put the weight of their numbers behind their particular ideals. The least original and independent, right? That the least original and independent. There's a reason that so many people feel and look like and act like carbon copies of each other. Here comes in the second negative principle of the selection. This is like the useful idiots, right? He will be able to obtain the support of all the docile and gullible, who have no strong convictions of their own, but are prepared to accept a ready-made system of values if it is only drummed into their ears sufficiently loudly and frequently. Into their ears sufficiently loudly and frequently. It will be those whose vague and imperfectly formed ideas are easily swayed and whose passions and emotions are readily aroused who will thus swell the ranks of the totalitarian party. The emotional, he says, the passionate, the people who wear their heart on their sleeve, they're going to be easily roused to the totalitarianism side because they're going to be easily swept up in an emotional decision rather than a rational and logical one. Right? The cake is a lie. Bush did 9/11. Thank you kindly. All of these references, right? All of these references to what has been put in place to control you. It is in connection with the deliberate effort of the skillful demagogue to weld together a closely coherent and homogeneous body of supporters that the third and perhaps most important negative element of selection enters. It seems to be almost a law of human nature that it is easier for people to agree on a negative program, on the hatred of an enemy, on the envy of those better off, than on any positive task, right? It's easier to hate than love, as long as it's someone who's the other this, the mask, the vaccinated, the unvaccinated, the Jew, the Christian, the Muslim, the other, right? The Nazi, the fascist, the Antifa, the whatever, the alt-right. These terms all serve as negative slanders instead of focusing on the big love. We've got to let love win. Big love, big hearts. The contrast between the we and the they, the common fight against those outside the group, seems to be an essential ingredient in any creed which will solidly knit together a group for common action. Even the Crusades, right? Christians have also fallen prey to this, just as the useful idiots and the totalitarians. Okay, so this is just like the propaganda doctrine that is practiced. He is just calling it out and showing how one side is using. It is consequently always employed by those who seek not merely support of a policy, but the unreserved allegiance of huge masses. From their point of view, it has the great advantage of leaving them greater freedom of action than almost any positive program. The enemy, whether he be internal, like the Jew or the kulak, or external, seems to be an indispensable requisite in the army of a totalitarian leader. It is the old story of the alien races being admitted only to the less respected trades, and then being hated still more for practicing them. The fact that German anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism spring from the same root is of great importance for the understanding of what has happened there, but this is rarely grasped by foreign observers. I've tabbed further on this page. Collectivism on a world scale seems to be unthinkable, except in the service of a small ruling elite. A small ruling elite would benefit from a united world collectivist totalitarian regime, and just keep that in mind. It would certainly raise not only technical, but above all moral problems, which none of our socialists is willing to face. What kind of moral problems would come into play, right? What if some AI, some small group, some increasingly intelligent group of people, what are they going to do in order to achieve this agenda, right? Following the money. And what is this AI going to do? Is it going to free the people, or is it going to work for this? Is it even going to know? And so the technological advancements are here. The technical knowledge now is upon us. As I go and review this book in 2024 with AI on the cusp of being a phenomenon in the world, who's going to control it? And is it truly going to be benevolent? One of the inherent contradictions of the collectivist philosophy is that while basing itself on the humanistic morals which individualism has developed, it is practicable only within a relatively small group. That socialism, so long as it remains theoretical, is internationalist, while as soon as it is put into practice, whether in Russia or in Germany, it becomes violently nationalist. It is one of the reasons why liberal socialism, as most people in the Western world imagine it, is purely theoretical, while the practice of socialism everywhere is totalitarian. This is Cliff noted with number 3. It's CF period. Now the instructive discussion in Franz Borkenau's Socialism, National or International, London, G. Routledge and Sons, 1942. The independence of small nations might mean something to the liberal individualist. It meant nothing to collectivists like themselves. I can still hear Sidney Webb explaining to me that the future belonged to the great administrative nations, where the officials govern and the police keep order. George Bernard Shaw argued about the same time that the world is too big and powerful states by necessity, and the little ones must come within their border or be crushed out of existence. I have quoted at length these passages, which would not surprise one in description of the German ancestors of National Socialism, because they provide so characteristic an example of that glorification of power which easily leads from socialism to nationalism, and which profoundly affects the ethical views of all collectivists. Well, to the great individualist socialist philosophers of the 19th century, to a Lord Acton or a Jacob Burckhardt, down to contemporary socialists like Bertrand Russell, who have inherited the liberal tradition, power itself has always appeared the arch evil, to the strict collectivist, it is a goal in itself, which is footnoted with number 9 here. The Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt wrote principally about the Italian Renaissance and Greek civilization, hoping that knowledge of the foundations of European culture would serve as a bulwark against the social, political, and cultural upheavals that he witnessed in the 19th century. Based on lectures he had delivered just prior to the formation of the German Empire, he presciently warned about coming periods of great national wars and of dangers of all-powerful states. I also missed a footnote here on the previous page about a history of the English people by Eli Halevi. Halevi's first book was translated as The Era of Tyrannies, Essay on Socialism and War, and the discussion of the Webbs and Shaw may be found on 271. Irish playwright and essayist George Bernard Shaw was an early member of the Fabian Society. His most famous work was Pygmalion, but he was also known in the interwar period for such tracts as The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism, going back to Russell and the Social Life According to a Unitary Plan from it, like it springs from the desire of power, and the arch evil is the goal in itself to the strict collectivist is the arch evil of power itself is the evil thing. And then he continues to go on to say that it is not only, as Russell has so well described, that the desire to organize social life according to a unitary plan itself springs largely from a desire for power. Okay, so the footnote for that quote just goes to page 211 in the Scientific Outlook, published by Bertrand Russell. It is even more the outcome of the fact that in order to achieve their end, collectivists must create power over men wielded by other men of a magnitude never before known, and that their success will depend on the extent to which they achieve such power. This remains true even though many liberal socialists are guided in their endeavors by the tragic illusion that by depriving private individuals of the power they possess in an individualist system, and by transferring this power to society, that they can somehow thereby extinguish power. I've tabbed on the next page that we have seen before how the separation of economic and political aims is an essential guarantee of individual freedom, and how it is consequently attacked by all collectivists. What is called economic power, while it can be an instrument of coercion, is in the hands of private individuals. Never exclusive or complete power, never power over the whole life of a person, but centralized as an instrument of political power, it creates a degree of dependence scarcely distinguishable from slavery. I've highlighted a few paragraphs here, so let's dive in. From the two central features of every collectivist system, the need for a commonly accepted system of ends of the group and all the overriding desire to give to the group the maximum of power to achieve these ends, grows a definite system of morals, which on some points coincides and on others violently contrasts with ours, but differs from it in one point which makes it doubtful whether we can call it morals, that it does not leave the individual conscience free to apply its own rules. It does not even know any general rules which the individual is required or allowed to observe in all circumstances. This makes collectivist morals so different from what we have known as morals that we find it difficult to discover any principle in them which they nevertheless possess. The difference of principle is very much the same as that which we have already considered in connection with the rule of law. Like formal law, the rules of individualist ethics, however unprecise they may be in many respects, are general and absolute. They prescribe or prohibit a general type of action, irrespective of whether in the particular instance the ultimate purpose is good or bad. To cheat or steal, to torture or betray a confidence is held to be bad, irrespective of whether or not the particular instance any harm follows from it. Neither the fact that in a given instance nobody may be the worse for it, nor any high purpose for which such an act may have been committed can alter the fact that it is bad. Though we may sometimes be forced to choose between different evils, they remain evils. The principle that the end justifies the means is an individualist ethics regarded as the denial of all morals. In collectivist ethics, it becomes necessarily the supreme rule. There is literally nothing which the consistent collectivist must not be prepared to do if it serves the good of the whole, because the good of the whole to him is only the criterion of what ought to be done. So whatever is good for the whole has to be done no matter what, and this is the ethic that the end justifies the means does not get called into consideration here, because if it's for the good of the whole, the individual no longer has control who it's not good for to better their circumstance or move or escape, right? The suitability of the particular act for the end in the view and what is the raison d'etat affirms with respect to the relations between different countries apply equally to the relations between different individuals within the collective state. There can be no limit to what its citizens must be prepared to do. No act which his conscience must prevent him from committing, if it is necessary for an end which the community has set itself or which his superiors order him to achieve. The absence of absolute formal rules in collectivist ethics does not, of course, mean that there are not some useful habits of the individuals which a collectivist community will encourage and others which it will discourage. Quite the reverse. It will take a much greater interest in the individual's habits of life than an individualist community. To a useful member of a collectivist society requires very definite qualities which must be strengthened by constant practice. The reason why we designate these qualities as useful habits and can hardly describe them as moral virtues is that the individual could never be allowed to put these rules above any definite orders or to let them become an obstacle to the achievement of any particular aims of his community. They only serve, as it were, to fill any gaps which direct orders or the designation of particular aims may leave, but they can never justify conflict with the will of the authority. important qualities which facilitate the intercourse between men in a free society: kindliness and a sense of humor, personal modesty, and a respect for the privacy and belief in the good intentions of one's neighbor. Virtues which smooth social contacts and which make control from above less necessary and at the same time more difficult. They are virtues which flourish wherever the individualist or commercial type of society has prevailed, and which are missing according as the collectivist or military type of society predominates. So the thing is like the good always wins, is what he's saying here. Virtues always flourish no matter what, and a collectivist authority is going to stomp out that virtue, right? The individual's ability to trust thy neighbor, to be kind, to have a sense of humor, to be personally modest, and respect others' people's privacy is above all godliness in many, many ways. And that a collectivist society cannot achieve this kind of equality. For it is the good that transcends. It is the good that perpetuates the good forward. And the good always does win in the end. For the great majority of them, the opposite is probably true, that the intensity of the moral emotions behind a movement like that of the National Socialism or Communism can probably be compared only to those of the great religious movements of history. Once you admit that the individual is just merely a means to serve the ends of the higher entity called the society or the nation, most of those features of totalitarian regimes which horrify us follow of necessity. Totalitarian regimes does not necessarily mean a communist totalitarian or a fascist totalitarianism regime, but it does mean totalitarian regime. And whether that regime is achieved through swinging things so far to the left, the right comes in and snatches it up by the use of useful idiots, or if it is achieved by too many virtuous people getting too tired of all the evils and atrocities committed and going the fascist route. That's why books like this are very important to help draw that line and bring to the forefront the proper perspective to take when assessing these models. From the collectivist standpoint, intolerance and brutal suppression of dissent, the complete disregard of the life and happiness of the individual are essential and unavoidable consequences of this basic premise. And the collectivist can admit this and at the same time claim that his system is superior to one in which the selfish interests of the individual are allowed to obstruct the full realization of the ends the community pursues. Where there is one, if people just want to have a private life and live in a cabin, you like just let them have that and don't come in and try to, force something upon people who just want to live meek lives, as it were. The biblical term meek, the people who just want to enjoy the time that they have on this earth by serving others, serving their families, serving their friends. These people do not need to be forced to participate in some form of collectivist system when capitalism gives them plenty of freedom to earn the living that they desire and make the appropriate sacrifices without having to be savages. Where there is one common all overriding end, there is no room for any general morals or rules. To a limited extent, we ourselves experience this in wartime, but even war in the greatest peril had led in the democratic countries only to a very moderate approach to totalitarianism, right? During wartime, times of suffering and strife, and true wartime, there is a little bit of a call to a higher personal ethic, a totalitarian personal ethic, not just for your good, but the good of the community and the good of the future of the people in that community, the children and the children's children, right? There's this higher personal ethic. But even then, it's only very moderate, a moderate half step towards totalitarianism, and hopefully is let up. And so do not let the effects of fake wars and fake terror and fake news be some way to enforce more of a totalitarian regime. Just because it is a communist or socialist agenda doesn't mean that there's not a fascist or right-wing or alt-right agenda as well. So anything that approaches totalitarianism, I think we can all agree, is something to be aware of. It is inevitable that occasionally cruelty may become a duty, that acts which revolt all of our feelings, such as the shooting of hostages or the killing of the old or sick, should be treated as mere matters of expediency in a communist or totalitarianism state. Conscription of women for breeding purposes can also be seriously contemplated in a totalitarianism society. To be a useful assistant in the running of a totalitarian state, it is not enough that a man should be prepared to accept specious justification of vile deeds. He must himself be prepared actively to break every moral rule he has ever known if it seems necessary to achieve the end set for him. Since it is the supreme leader who alone determines the ends, His instruments must have no moral convictions of their own. They must above all be unreservedly committed to the person of the leader. But next to this, the most important thing is that they should be completely unprincipled and literally capable of everything. They must have no ideals of their own which they want to realize, no ideas about right or wrong. And as there will be need for actions which are bad in themselves, and which, although still influenced by traditional morals, will be reluctant to perform, the readiness to do bad things becomes a path to promotion and power in a totalitarianism state. Yes, it is through positions like these that the road to the highest positions in the totalitarianism state leads. It is only too true when a distinguished American economist concludes from a similar brief enumeration of the duties of the authorities of a collectivist state that they would have to do these things whether they wanted to or not, and the probability of the people in power being individuals who would dislike the possession and exercise of power is on a level with the probability that an extremely tender-hearted person would get the job of whipping master in a slave plantation. That is footnoted as Professor Frank H. Knight, Book Review, Walter Lippmann's The Good Society, Journal of Political Economy, Volume 46, December 1938, page 869. We cannot, however, exhaust this subject here. The problem of the selection of the leaders is closely bound up with the wide problem of selecting according to the opinions held, or rather, according to the readiness with which a person conforms to an ever-changing set of doctrines. And this leads us to one of the most characteristic moral features of totalitarianism, its relation to and its effect on all the virtues falling under the general heading of truthfulness. This is so big a subject that it requires a separate chapter entitled The End of Truth. The End of Truth. An opening quote by E.H. Carr. It is significant that the nationalization of thought has proceeded everywhere, pari passu with the nationalization of industry. And pari passu again means at the same time. If the feeling of oppression in totalitarian countries is less acute, this is because the totalitarian governments succeed to a high degree in making people think as they want them to. And even the most intelligent and independent people cannot entirely escape that influence if they are long isolated from other sources of information. While in the totalitarian states, this status of propaganda gives it a unique power over the minds of people. A couple of pages later, I've highlighted, like their freedom, the collective freedom he offers is not the freedom of the members of society, but the unlimited freedom of the planner to do with society what he pleases. Footnoted in Peter Drucker, The End of Economic Man, op citation, page 74, correctly observes that the less freedom there is, the more there is talk of the new freedom. Yet this new freedom is a mere word which covers the exact contradiction of all that Europe ever understood by freedom. The new freedom which is preached in Europe is, however, the right of the majority against the individual. The first part of the quotation actually appears on page 79 and the last part on page 80. It is not difficult to deprive the great majority of independent thought, but the minority who will retain an inclination to criticize must also be silent. Since many parts of this code will never be explicitly stated, if the people are to support the common effort without hesitation, they must be convinced that not only the end aimed at, but also the means chosen are the right one. I've tabbed on the next page, and the whole apparatus for spreading knowledge, the schools, the press, the radio, and motion picture will be used exclusively to spread those views which, whether true or false, will strengthen the belief in the rightness of the decisions taken by the authority. And I would say here that Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky is a great look into this. The propaganda model and the authoritarianism that is the US government, the CIA, and the deep state. All the information that might cause doubt or hesitation will be withheld. The probable effect on the people's loyalty to the system becomes the only criterion for deciding whether a particular piece of information is to be published or suppressed. The basis of unfavorable comparisons with conditions elsewhere, the knowledge of possible alternatives to the course actually taken, information which might suggest failure on the part of the government to live up to its promises or to take advantage of opportunities to improve conditions, all will be suppressed. This applies even to fields apparently most remote from any political interests, and particularly to all the sciences, even the most abstract. That in the disciplines dealing directly with human affairs, and therefore most immediately affected political views, such as history, law, or economics, the disinterested search for truth cannot be allowed in a totalitarianism system, and the vindication of the official views becomes the sole object. It is not surprising that in these spheres, even the pretense that they search for truth is abandoned, and that the authorities decide what doctrines ought to be taught and published. Nor does it make much difference whether certain theorems of mathematical statistics are attacked because they form a part of the class struggle on the ideological frontier and are a product of the historical role of mathematics as the servant of the bourgeoisie, or whether the whole subject is condemned because it provides no guarantee that it will serve the interests of the people. It is entirely keeping with the whole spirit of totalitarianism that it condemns any human activity done for its own sake and without an ulterior purpose. There is no relaxation for the sake of relaxation. There is no vacation to the beach to go enjoy the water hitting and the waves crashing. There is none of this in a totalitarianism system. Everything has to be done for the greater good 24 hours a day. Science for science sake, art for art's sake are equally abhorrent to the Nazis, our socialist intellectuals, and the communists. Every activity must derive its justification from a conscious social purpose. Incredible as some of the aberrations may appear, they are a direct result of that same desire to see everything directed by a unitary conception of the whole, of the need to uphold at all costs the views in the service of which people are asked to make constant sacrifices, and of the general idea that the knowledge and beliefs of the people are an instrument to be used for a single purpose. Once science has to serve not truth, but the interest of a class, a community, or a state, the sole task of argument and discussion is to vindicate and to spread still further the beliefs by which the whole life of the community is directed. As the Nazi Minister of Justice has explained, the question which every new scientific theory must ask itself is, do I serve National Socialism for the greatest benefit of all? Franz Gertner is footnoted here as the Nazi Minister of Justice from 1933 through 1941. Franz Schlegelberger followed as acting minister, and Otto Georg Thierack served as minister from 1942 to 1945. It is not clear which one is responsible for the statement of the text. The disappearance of the spirit of independent inquiry and of the belief in the power of rational conviction. And this will all happen with the loss of the sense of the meaning of truth. Perhaps the most alarming fact is that contempt for intellectual liberty is not a thing which arises only once the totalitarianism system is established, but one which can be found everywhere among intellectuals who have embraced a collectivist faith and who are acclaimed as intellectual leaders even in countries still under a liberal regime. So nobody who is college educated or intellectual or who can read a book is going to be tolerated. There will be no independent intellectual pursuits allowed anymore. Only work in glorification for the greater good of the community as a whole and the small group that determines the direction of the economic authority. So long as dissent is not suppressed, there will always be some who will query the ideas ruling their contemporaries and put new ideas to the test of argument and propaganda. The interaction of individuals possessing different knowledge and different views is what constitutes the life of thought. The growth of reason is a social process based on the existence of such differences. That is bada bing, bada boom. The social differences, the discussions that come, right? The things, right? The interaction of individuals is what constitutes the life of thought. And any attempt to suppress another, whether they're on the left side or the right side of the political spectrum, is wrong. Because this does not lead to any intellectual greatness. This does not lead to any intellectual enlightenment. This is not okay. So in a totalitarianism system, pursuits of intellectualism are not allowed. Individualism is thus an attitude of humility before this social process and of tolerance to other opinions, and is the exact opposite of that intellectual hubris which is at the root of the demand for comprehensive direction of the social process. 12. The socialist roots of Nazism. The doctrines of National Socialism are the culmination of a long evolution of thought, a process in which thinkers who have had great influence far beyond the confines of Germany have taken part. The commercial civilization of England, who had lost all warlike instincts, nothing is more contemptible in his eyes than the universal striving after the happiness of the individual. Karl Marx is who he's referring to there. It is high time to recognize the fact that socialism must be power policy, because it is to be organization. Socialism has to win power. A few pages on, I've highlighted some footnotes here. German philosopher of history Oswald Spengler, 1880 to 1936, another critic of liberal parliamentary democracy, foretold the inevitable decay of European culture, which would be replaced by a new age of Caesarism, like Julius Caesar, analogous to the replacement of Greek culture by Roman, and the latter being uninspired, barbaric, disciplined, practical, and Protestant, in his book The Decline of the West. In his book Revolution von Rechts, Revolution on the Right, published in 1931, he called for an end to class struggles, and through educational reforms, the emergence of a German nationalist state of the people. That was Hans Freyer, another intellectual forerunner of the Nazis, who said that. On the next page, I've tabbed and highlighted, it was only a step from this for the patron saint of National Socialism, Moeller van den Broek, to proclaim World War I, a war between liberalism and socialism. We have lost the war against the West. Socialism has lost it against liberalism. As with Spengler, liberalism is, therefore, the archenemy. In quotes, there are no liberals in Germany today. There are young revolutionaries, there are young conservatives, but who would be a liberal? Liberalism is a philosophy of life from which German youth now turns with nausea, with wrath, with quite peculiar scorn, for there is none more foreign, more repugnant, more opposed to its philosophy. Which brings us to 13, the totalitarians in our midst. I don't have many highlights until a few pages in where I've highlighted a footnote, especially when we consider the proportion of former socialists who have become Nazis. I think that's just a good point to highlight. The revolution, which began in the last war, which has been the driving force of every significant political movement in the last 20 years, a revolution against the predominant ideas of the 19th century, liberal democracy, national self-determination, and laissez-faire economics. Further on, a few pages later, I've tabbed and highlighted, but while the entrepreneurs may well see their expectations borne out during a transition stage, it will not be long before they will find that they are no longer masters, but will in every respect have to be satisfied with whatever power and emoluments the government will concede to them. And this is him referencing what happened in Germany after socialism took hold. Tabbed and highlighted on the next page. But when we have to deal with many different monopolistic industries, there is much to be said for leaving them in different private hands rather than combining them under the single control of the state. Private monopoly is scarcely ever complete and even more rarely of long duration or able to disregard potential competition. But a state monopoly is always a state-protected monopoly, protected against both potential competition and effective criticism. There are no Yelp or Google reviews with the state monopoly. You can't just leave a bad review for the DMV and expect something good to come of it. At least with a private business, if you leave a bad review, the owner may reach out to you in an attempt to make it right. 14. Material conditions and ideal ends. I've highlighted some footnotes here on the first page. Drucker argued that Europeans have searched for freedom and equality over the centuries, first in spiritual and subsequently in intellectual, political, and economic spheres. Fascism emerged due to the failures of both capitalism and socialism to deliver on their promises of freedom and equality in the economic sphere. On the next page, though it is natural that as the world around us becomes more complex, our resistance grows against the forces which, without our understanding them, constantly interfere with individual hopes and plans. A complex civilization like ours is necessarily based on the individual's adjusting himself to changes whose cause and nature he cannot understand. You have to be adaptable in a civilization like ours. I've tabbed on the next page following that will always be connected with such a multitude of circumstances that no single mind will be able to grasp them, or even worse, those affected will put all the blame on an obvious, immediate, and avoidable cause, while the more complex interrelationships which determine the change remain inevitably hidden to them. And this is just talking about the director of a planned society. There will be interrelationships that form outside of their control that they will still not have control over. So a central planning authority just cannot be effective because of what two people outside of the central planning authority decide to do together. And it fails to see that unless this complex society is to be destroyed, the only alternative to submission to the impersonal and seeming irrational forces of the market is submission to an equally uncontrollable and therefore arbitrary power of other men. In his anxiety to escape the irksome restraints which he now feels, man does not realize that the new authoritarian restraints which will have to be deliberately imposed in their stead will be even more painful. So many people want, right, this communism, this socialism, this economic equality for all. You know, it's not fair that there's the rich out there, blah, blah, blah. But in order to attain that, the restraints that you have to welcome into your life, the control that you have to welcome into your life, the things that you now have to do is being commoditized. Every little part about your life will have to be controlled and planned in order for everybody to be equal. You will have so many restraints on the freedom of your daily life. If you like to go to work, come home, and then watch Netflix or TV, right? You're not going to be able to do that anymore because now you're going to have to go to your state-appointed job. You're going to have to come home probably to not your home or your family and provide and complete other duties on the home front that would be akin to an agrarian society. And in many ways, cleaning, laundry, and any of the ADLs, the activities of daily living, these will have to be doled out to people who may not want to do them because as the aging population grows, more and more elderly need care, and there's a huge labor demand for elder care. And so without this this free market in order to be able to solve this problem through either technology or whatever advancements, will not have that advancement possible, because this central authority, as he's saying, right, the multitude of circumstances that no single mind can grasp, is going to have to be able to grasp all of this. He's going to have to be able to grasp the fact that there are people who need help. There are shortages in labor. The amount of people who will have to go out and enter the trades to become carpenters, house builders, electricians, plumbers, and many of the other desperately needed trades and factory workers. As soon as this system of control is implemented, this is where you're going. These are the restraints that are going to have to be implemented. You are no longer going to have freedom to pursue an education and go into the job that you want to go into. You will be told by a central authority what time to report to work, where to go to work, and what to do with your free time. I've highlighted on the next page, we must now briefly return to the crucial point that individual freedom cannot be reconciled with the supremacy of one single purpose, to which the whole society must be entirely and permanently subordinated. Your freedom supersedes all of that. The ability for you to be a free and independent person of autonomy and free will cannot, he's saying this is the crucial point. It can't be reconciled. There's no way to make it happen. There's no way to make this fair, equitable, or anything like that and give you your freedom. Everybody has to become a prisoner of the system. It is sensible temporarily to sacrifice freedom in order to make it more secure in the future, but the same cannot be said for a system proposed as a permanent arrangement. It's one thing if it's war and it's dire and lives are at stake. It's another thing if it's on the whims of a small minority that are imposing their central authority on the planet as a whole, the nation as a whole. There is no longer freedom. There is only the will of the supreme authority. It should never be forgotten that the one decisive factor in the rise of totalitarianism on the continent, which is yet absent in England and America, is the existence of a large, recently dispossessed middle class. That's tabbed and highlighted as he places it towards the end, but I do want to bring that to attention. And we're about to do economic wars, our trade wars, and we're going to talk about that just a little bit. We're going to touch on the fact that the totalitarianism system only, the story of the kulaks is essential. And knowing that the doctors, accountants, attorneys, these were the people who were targeted, not the actual truly wealthy, but the people who were perceived as being wealthy, this middle class, as it were, this upper middle class, as it were. And so this dispossessed middle class that gets forced into poverty, without it, is what leads to totalitarianism. And we'll see that the economic war that has been happening that doesn't get talked about in the media, if you understand that, then you'll understand that classism pervades capitalism, and it's an evil of many sorts that we need to eradicate. And if we're able to eradicate it through capitalism, which everybody has the ability in capitalism to better their station in life, with the central planning authority, they do not have the ability to better that station in life. And so the important thing to take away from this is that if something, say another nation, is trying to eradicate the middle class, or say some central banking authority that may have been infiltrated or may have some kind of socialist agenda, what would they do to give rise to a middle class and then take everything away in order to dispossess that middle class, right? Shake the ants up in the proverbial jar so that the black ants attack the red ants and the red ants attack the black ants. That's what we need to be careful of. That in the sphere of individual conduct, the effect of collectivism has been almost entirely destructible is both inevitable and undeniable. A movement whose main promise is the relief from responsibility. Remember, that's the promise, is that you are no longer responsible. That's one of the biggest things. Everybody's going to be equal, and you don't have to worry about it anymore, and you don't have to worry about how to better your position in life. He finishes it up about, so we'll go back, a movement whose main promise is the relief from responsibility cannot but be anti-moral in its effect, however lofty the ideals to which it owes its birth. It is true that the virtues which are less esteemed in practice now, independence, self-reliance, and the willingness to bear risks, and readiness to back one's own conviction against a majority, and the willingness to voluntary cooperation with one's neighbors, are essentially those on which the working of an individualist society rests. Okay, so it's not just an individualist society, but it's a society developed naturally through cooperation. This readiness to back your conviction and be a contrarian, and to voluntarily cooperate with one's neighbors. The community is what makes us strong. If there is a force or an agenda that serves to divide the family and the community for the good of the whole, if this is the outcome of whatever the action is that you are doing, whatever it is that you are working towards or thinking of, this is what you have to be careful of if this is happening. Anything that serves to divide is only looking to conquer. 15. The prospects of international order. This is basically a one world government, a federal system that restrains sovereign power and gives it to a central world or globe authority. Let's see what Hayek has to say. My highlight on the first page or two in that says, "We have defeated National Socialism merely to create a world of many National Socialists, differing in detail, but all equally totalitarian, nationalistic, and in recurrent conflict with each other." I think that's what Jordan Peterson means when he says the left eats itself. But we have kind of defeated the one main socialist ideal. But in the end of the day, there's still many cropping up, which, right, good for them. If they want to be true and go live in a commune and have and delegate socialist roles and generate whatever they can amongst themselves, they will soon find, of course, as Adam Smith said, that the means of production are very important. But we do see societies like the Amish doing very well in their own little niche, right? Doing their own thing, and thank God for all of the land available in America and the freedom it provides in order to do that. If a society or a group so wishes to alienate itself, it may thus do so in a capitalist society. However, to force it onto others does beg the moral and ethical question. So that's what he means by that. And of course, they are all in conflict with each other, right? Because the more people who are socialists, it's like the greatest multi-level marketing scheme, except there's only just a few at the top. And the more people who are socialists, the better off for the people at the top. So of course it serves to give, like he says earlier, a small minority the majority power. Those who at least partly realize these dangers usually draw the conclusion that economic planning must be done internationally, i.e. by some supranational authority. So again, that's kind of the agenda. When people who slowly fall into socialist and this way of thinking, they slowly want to give power to a central group. And of course, as he shows, it's the malevolent forces, the evil forces, they want that power. And of course, they're going to create organizations like the World Economic Forum. Of course, they're going to influence corporations through money by coming on and agreeing with their agenda and pushing it to the masses, right? So this is just something that we've got to be very, very careful of and cognizant of when it's happening. The people of any one country may easily be persuaded to make a sacrifice in order to assist what they regard as their iron industry or their agriculture, or in order that in their country nobody should sink below a certain level, so long it is a question of helping people whose habits of life and ways of thinking are familiar to us, of correcting the distribution of incomes among or the working conditions of people we can well imagine and whose views on their appropriate status are fundamentally similar to ours. We are usually ready to make some sacrifices. A homogenous group. That's why you see so many Eastern European countries thriving so heavily with these socialist regimes that they've implemented. It's because they're homogenous. They share the same values. They don't have to worry about any sort of thievery or robbery or vandalism or criminal behavior because they all share the same values and everything can be a little bit more evenly distributed. What they fail to realize, I would maybe posit without any proof here, but with the education system and capitalism being the way that it is, it does kind of bring people to the lowest common denominator thinking, and thus the tragedy of the commons exists. And so these little Eastern European countries that are thriving, right, with these socialist systems, they're thriving only because of the geopolitical conditions of the entire world, the geoeconomic conditions of globalization. And the fact is that their imports are doing the very things that they say that they preach against, but they're predatory practices on indigenous populations just the same. It's just their country is able to house it and keep them so insulated from the evils of capitalism. But while they're importing these same very goods, mimicking these same very capitalist corporations, and even maybe in some instances working working for some global corporation. The fact is that capitalism gives rise to so much good. And yes, there is evil within it. There is much evil within it. And that's why we need to be the beings of light that we are and fight it so heavily. We need to seek justice, and we need to do what we can to raise those around us out. But we also need to be aware of the people, right? The elites, the intelligentsia, the people at the top who so selfishly benefit from the subjugation of so many people and the masses. Who imagines that there exist any common ideals of distributive justice such as will make the Norwegian fisherman consent to forego the prospect of economic improvement in order to help his Portuguese fellow, or the Dutch worker to pay more for his bicycle to help the Coventry mechanic, or the French peasant to pay more taxes to insist in the industrialization of Italy, right? So this is the essence of the globalized system. Not only just what I talked about, but just the very fact that your taxes are going to be going to help somebody in China, Asia, India, Russia, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Kuwait, Somalia, Tibet, Libya, Italy, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Wales, somewhere in Canada maybe, or somewhere in Central America or South America, maybe Chile, maybe Brazil, maybe Puerto Rico. The thing is that once the globalized system is in place, everybody is now a wage slave, no matter what. And your taxes and everything that you earn, whether you're doing an easy job that's mindless and repetitive, like going to a factory and stamping a car, or if you have to go mine lithium in order for the electric vehicle revolution or something similar, whatever this means, whether your work is intense or not, you're all going to have the same outcome. And so how is this done? If most people are not willing to see the difficulty, this is mainly because consciously or unconsciously, they assume that it will be they who will settle these questions for the others, and because they are convinced of their own capacity to do this justly and equitably. And that is really the crux of the matter. Everybody, and you can be honest with yourself here. You can go with the Jung, right? The idea of the id, the shadow self. You can totally imagine a world where you are king supreme and you are the end all be all of justice and equity in this world. And at the end of the day, Hayek argues that that's impossible, that everybody is corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you are given this position to basically be Lord and Savior to all of humanity, you're not going to be able to do it because you are only human and you will err. And so that is why capitalism is the most honest system that there is, because you have to be honest in order to flourish in this system. You have to be of good character. You have to be a person of your word and deliver the goods at any cost. All right. So that's why you put so much time and effort into building proposals and doing bids and becoming profitable, because you have learned a skill of some sort that provides value to other people, and other people are willing to pay you in order to shorten the time that they have to spend doing something similar. And so that is the beauty of the system. It is a mistake to regard the brutality and the disregard of all the wishes and ideals of the smaller people shown by the Germans simply as a sign of their special wickedness. It is the nature of the task that they have assumed which makes these things inevitable, right? So this is him saying that you can't blame the German people themselves for what happened. Just as you can't really blame the soldiers who had to rationalize when they were exterminating Jewish mothers and children, right? I'm just repeating facts here from other books that I've read based on history. There's some very dark things that happened, and this one book studies the mindset and talks to the soldiers who did these terrible things. And they have to rationalize in their mind, for instance, the one situation that just burned in the memory of the soldier who rationalized he was the one who had to shoot the children after the other soldier shot the mother. They would separate them from the mother, and then one Nazi soldier would shoot the mother, and then the other soldier took the children and had to shoot the children and kill the children. And the way that he rationalized this was that the children cannot live without their mother. And since other soldier A, my other soldier in this same unit as me, is going to kill that mother, I have a duty to kill these children because they will grow up without a mother. And this is sinister. This is what is demanded of an authoritarian economic regime of some sort, to even out the odds, to take from the haves to give to the have-nots. And even though this totalitarian regime ended in this bloodiness, as they all do, whether it's Mao or Guevara or Lenin or Trotsky or basically any of these regimes that we've seen, somebody has to die. Otherwise, there can be no equity. What is the rationalization of this? We don't know. We don't know what drives the people in authority to choose this devastating outcome, this extinguishing of life, these terrible atrocities that we now know exist. It is curious to observe how those who pose as the most hard-boiled realists and who lose no opportunity of casting ridicule on the utopianism of those who believe in the possibility of an international political order, yet regard as more practical the much more intimate and irresponsible interference with the lives of the different peoples which economic planning involves, and believe that, once hitherto undreamed of power is given to an international government which has just been represented as not being capable of enforcing a simple rule of law, this greater power will be used in so unselfish and so obviously just a manner as to command general consent. If anything is evident, he goes on to say, they will never submit to the direction which international economic planning involves. No one person in any country, especially if you are suffering and starving and you are watching your children die, is going to be okay with this international authority taking your money and giving it to someone in another nation who you have never met in order so that they may be just a little bit more or less poor than you. It just does not sit well with human nature. Neither an omnipotent superstate nor a loose association of free nations, but a community of nations of free men must be our goal. Wisely used, the federal principle of organization may indeed prove the best solution of some of the world's most difficult problems, but its application is a task of extreme difficulty, and we are not likely to succeed if in an over-ambitious attempt we strain it beyond its capacity. I made a little note questioning if maybe AI will be able to figure out what he's talking about there and make it so that it is not strained. A federal principle of organization for at least the most difficult problems. Hunger, starvation, homelessness. If an AI can show us that it is benevolent by solving hunger, homelessness, and at least unimpoverishing many people, maybe we will let it have a little bit more authority. Conclusion, chapter 16. My first highlight is towards the bottom of the page as well as the footnote. We shall not grow wiser before we learn that much that we have done was very foolish. If we are to build a better world, we must have the courage to make a new start, even if that means some reculer pour mieux sauter. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it is footnoted as the phrase reculer pour mieux sauter is the recommendation to back up a little before renewing one's attack. The advice to drop back and punt might serve as a rough American equivalent. All right, the Sun Tzu or Art of War equivalent, if you've been watching any more of this channel, is the retreat before renewing one's attack. Retreat, regain your strength, and then press forward once again. It is not those who believe in inevitable tendencies who show this courage, not those who preach a new order, which is no more than a projection of the tendencies of the last 40 years and who can think of nothing better than to imitate Hitler. It is indeed those who cry the loudest for the new order who are most completely under the sway of the ideas which have created this war and most of the evils from which we suffer. If in the first attempt to create a world of free men we have failed, we must try again. The guiding principle that a policy of freedom for the individual is the only truly progressive policy remains as true today as it was in the 19th century. And so he closes with such a strong argument that the only just and equitable thing is to be able to provide a world of free men, able to choose their own path in life. And for anything else, it is not ethical, it is not just, and it is not fair. The only thing is to provide freedom to all and for everybody to be free. So, now that we've wrapped up The Road to Serfdom, I would love to hear in the comments below what you thought about my takes on it, my highlights, if you've read the book, of course, and if you have any takeaways that you want to provide below. Don't forget to smash that like button. It helps the algorithm and it helps me tremendously. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be doing more and more books as time goes on and as time allows. This is a passion for me. I love reading. I love highlighting. I love putting tabs on books. I don't love reading all of the book, and in fact, it does get a little exhausting from time to time to read these, but I do want to initiate a conversation, and I do want to hear more, and I can't wait to see these clips being used for people to respond to create the discussion around. I look forward to that, so feel free to clip me, respond to me, and let's try to start some kind of international discussion with the use of technology over these principles from so long ago and see which ones we may be able to change for the betterment of a better world.